High atop West Mountain in Eureka Springs, Arkansas, the Crescent Hotel still watches over the valley below, a limestone castle frozen in time, its towers and turrets silhouetted against the Ozark sky. Tourists come by the thousands each year, drawn not only by its Victorian grandeur, but by something darker. They walk its corridors hoping to glimpse shadows that shouldn't be there. They book rooms where the dead are said to linger. Because the Crescent Hotel carries a reputation as America's most haunted hotel, and that haunting has a name, Norman Baker. From 1937 to 1940, this building wasn't a hotel at all. It was a hospital, or rather, it claimed to be. Baker, a charlatan with no medical training, transformed the Crescent into a fraudulent cancer clinic, exploiting the dying with promises of miracle cures. Desperate patients arrived seeking hope. What they found was a con man peddling injections of alcohol, watermelon seeds, and lies. As they withered, in agony, Baker forced them to write letters home, glowing testimonials claiming they'd never felt better. Many never left. Their bodies were carried down to a makeshift morgue in the basement, just another casualty of Baker's greed. But this story begins long before the ghosts. It begins in 1886, in the golden age of American ambition, when two railroad magnates looked at this remote mountain and saw opportunity. When the promise wasn't death, but healing. When the Crescent Hotel rose as a monument to Gilded Age excess, a castle built on hope before it became a tomb built on fraud. Chapter 1. The Birth of Eureka Springs. The story of Eureka Springs, like so many American boomtowns, begins with a promise of salvation hidden in the earth. Long before white settlers arrived, the Osage people knew these hills held something sacred, the springs that bubbled up from the limestone bedrock. More than 60 of them scattered throughout the hollows were believed to possess healing properties. The Osage carved ceremonial basins near the waters, treating them as holy sites where the sick could be restored. It was a belief that would later fuel an entire city's economy, though by then the Osage would be long gone, pushed westward by the same tide of settlement that discovered their secrets anew. The white discovery came in the mid-1850s, though discovery is perhaps too generous a word for what was really appropriation of indigenous knowledge. Dr. Alva Jackson, a physician practicing in the region, supposedly stumbled upon one of the springs while treating his young son's chronic eye ailment. Story goes that after bathing the boy's eyes in the spring water for several weeks, the condition miraculously improved. Jackson, ever the entrepreneur, immediately recognized opportunity. He established a practice in a nearby cave and began bottling the water, selling it under the name Dr. Jackson's Eye Water. It was primitive medical hucksterism, but in an age before antibiotics or modern ophthalmology, desperate people would try anything. For years, Jackson's operation remained small. A local curiosity, nothing more. The springs might have faded into obscurity, one more folk remedy lost to history, if not for what happened in 1879. That year, Jackson invited an old friend to visit, Judge Levi Bess Saunders, a prominent figure suffering from a festering leg wound that refused to heal. Saunders was skeptical, but desperate men make willing converts. He agreed to try the waters. What happened next depends on who's telling the story. According to local legend, within just a few weeks of bathing in the springs, Saunders' wound had completely healed. Whether this was genuine mineral properties, placebo effect, or simply the natural healing process doesn't really matter. What matters is that Saunders believed, and more importantly, he talked. Judge Saunders returned to his home convinced he'd experienced a miracle. He began spreading word of the healing springs throughout his considerable social network across Arkansas and Missouri. When asked what the place should be called, his son Buck suggested Eureka Spring, a reference to Archimedes' legendary exclamation, meaning, "I have found it." The name stuck. It was perfect marketing, exotic, classical, promising revelation. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By 1879, word of Eureka Springs had spread across the region like wildfire. The sick, the elderly, the chronically ill, anyone suffering from ailments that conventional medicine couldn't cure, began making pilgrimages to the Ozark Hills. They came in wagons, on horseback, some carried on litters by family members. They came seeking what Dr. Jackson and Judge Saunders had promised: salvation in spring water. The population explosion was staggering. Within a single year, Eureka Springs transformed from a handful of temporary camps into a legitimate settlement. By 1880, an estimated 2,000 homes had been constructed, and over 15,000 people were residing in what had been wilderness just months before. It was one of the fastest municipal growths in American history, a boomtown built not on gold or silver, but on hope. The Arkansas State Legislature, recognizing the economic potential, moved quickly to incorporate Eureka Springs as an official city in 1880. Almost overnight, the rough camp became a destination. Hotels sprang up, initially crude affairs, but growing more sophisticated as the money poured in. Bathhouses were constructed where visitors could immerse themselves in the supposedly curative waters. Bottling operations expanded, shipping healing water across the country to those who couldn't make the journey. Eureka Springs became, in the parlance of the era, a health resort, a place where the ill came to be made whole. For the business class, particularly those in the railroad industry, Eureka Springs represented something even more valuable than health: profit. The town's explosive growth revealed a fundamental truth about the Gilded Age American economy. There was money to be made in suffering. The springs themselves cost nothing to access, but getting people to them, housing them, feeding them, entertaining them while they took the cure, that required infrastructure, and infrastructure required capital. Railroad magnates across the Midwest took notice. Eureka Springs was isolated, accessible only by rough mountain roads that took days to traverse. But a railroad line could change that. A railroad could bring thousands more visitors, could transform a regional attraction into a national phenomenon. And where there were visitors, there was need for accommodations, grand accommodations, the kind that would justify premium ticket prices and extended stays. This was the opportunity that caught the attention of two men in particular, Powell Clayton and Richard Cairns. Both had made fortunes in railroads. Both understood that the real money wasn't in the springs themselves. It was in controlling access to them. And both recognized that what Eureka Springs desperately needed was a hotel grand enough to match its reputation, a mountaintop palace worthy of a miracle. Chapter 2: The Visionaries. Powell Clayton and Richard Cairns were not men who built their fortunes on inheritance or luck. They were self-made titans of the Gilded Age, forged in war and tempered by the cutthroat world of post-Civil War American capitalism. By the time they turned their attention to Eureka Springs in the early 1880s, both had already lived several lifetimes' worth of ambition. Powell Clayton's story reads like a textbook case of American reinvention. Born in Pennsylvania in 1833, he graduated from an engineering program and seemed destined for a quiet career in civil infrastructure. Then the Civil War erupted, and Clayton, like so many young men of his generation, found his true calling in chaos. He enlisted in the Union Army, rising quickly through the ranks to become a brigadier general in the 5th Kansas Infantry. His military career took him deep into Arkansas, where he led cavalry operations during some of the war's most brutal Western campaigns. Rather than return north, Clayton stayed in Arkansas, occupied Confederate territory ripe with opportunity for ambitious Republicans willing to navigate the treacherous waters of Reconstruction. By 1868, just 3 years after the war's end, Powell Clayton had been elected governor of Arkansas. His governorship was marked by the violence of the Reconstruction era. Clayton faced constant threats from the Ku Klux Klan. He responded with overwhelming force, organizing a state militia and declaring martial law where necessary. He established himself as a man who didn't flinch from confrontation. But politics, Clayton discovered, had limits. Real power, the kind that transcended elections and legislative battles, resided in economics. So, when his gubernatorial term ended, Clayton pivoted. He moved to Little Rock and threw himself into the world of business, specifically railroads. Clayton understood that the man who controlled the tracks controlled everything that moved on them. By 1880, Clayton had become president of the Little Rock, Mississippi, and Texas Railroad. From there, he expanded his influence, brokering deals and building connections throughout the industry. His partner in the Eureka Springs venture was Richard Cairns, a man whose path to power was far more direct: transportation. Of Irish heritage, Cairns began his career as a wagon master, the frontier term for men who organized and led supply trains across dangerous territory. It was brutal work that required equal parts logistics genius and physical courage. But Cairns, like Clayton, understood that the real money wasn't in hauling freight yourself. It was in owning the systems that moved it. He parlayed his wagon master experience into contracts with the U.S. Mail Service, then into stage line operations, and finally into railroads. By the time he met Clayton, Cairns was overseeing mail delivery along several major rail routes, including the St. Louis and San Francisco Railway, better known as the Frisco Railroad. The Frisco line was crucial. It connected St. Louis to Texas, cutting through Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. It was one of the most profitable routes in the Midwest. Cairns held a powerful position: Chief Deputy U.S. Marshal for the Frisco Line's territory. It was a role that gave him both governmental authority and deep ties to railroad management. When Cairns and Clayton looked at Eureka Springs in the early 1880s, they saw what every railroad man dreamed of: untapped demand. Thousands of people were already flooding into the region despite terrible access. The mountain roads were rutted, dangerous, and took days to traverse. Imagine, they realized, what would happen if you could take a comfortable train directly to Eureka Springs. Imagine the volume of passengers willing to pay premium prices for that convenience. So, Clayton and Cairns formed a plan. First, they would establish the Eureka Springs Railroad, a spur line connecting the isolated resort town to the main Frisco line at Seligman, Missouri. This would transform a multi-day wagon journey into a few hours of comfortable rail travel. Second, and more importantly, they would build a hotel so magnificent that it would become a destination in itself. Not just lodging, but a palace, a mountaintop resort, the kind of place that wealthy travelers from St. Louis, Chicago, and beyond would dream of visiting. In 1884, Clayton and Cairns moved forward with both projects simultaneously. The railroad construction began, and Clayton's company, the Eureka Springs Improvement Company, or ESIC, purchased 27 acres of prime mountaintop land overlooking the entire valley. The location was perfect, dramatic, isolated, with sweeping views that would impress even the wealthiest guests. But building a structure worthy of such a location required the right architect. Not just someone competent, but someone with vision, someone who could blend European grandeur with American ambition. Clayton and Cairns found their man in St. Louis, Isaac S. Taylor, an architect whose reputation for blending French Renaissance elegance with Richardsonian Romanesque solidity had made him one of the most sought-after designers in the Midwest. They commissioned him with a simple directive: build us a mountaintop palace. Make it the most opulent resort America has ever seen. Spare no expense. Taylor accepted, and the Crescent Hotel began to rise. Chapter 3. The Architect, Isaac Taylor. Isaac S. Taylor never intended to become an architect. His path to designing one of America's most iconic hotels began improbably with dead languages. Born in Nashville, Tennessee, Taylor enrolled at St. Louis University with every intention of becoming a classical scholar. He spent his early academic years immersed in Latin and Greek, but fate, as it often does, had other plans. While still a student, Taylor took a job at the architectural firm of George Ingram Barnett in St. Louis, initially just to pay expenses. But something happened in Barnett's office that changed everything. Surrounded by drafting tables, blueprints, and models of buildings yet to exist, Taylor discovered he had a gift. The same mind that excelled at parsing ancient syntax proved equally adept at understanding proportion, balance, and spatial design. He fell in love with architecture the way some men fall in love with people, suddenly, completely, and without the ability to turn back. Taylor abandoned his classical studies and committed himself entirely to learning the architect's craft. Under Barnett's mentorship, he studied the principles of design, mastered technical drawing, and absorbed the aesthetic movement sweeping through American architecture in the 1870s and 80s. He was particularly drawn to two seemingly contradictory styles: the ornate elegance of French Renaissance design and the heavy, muscular presence of Richardsonian Romanesque. Most architects favored one approach, or the other. Taylor's genius was in blending them. He understood that a building could be both delicate and imposing. This fusion became his signature: structures that felt simultaneously elegant and eternal, designed for beauty, but built to outlast generations. By the early 1880s, Taylor had opened his own firm in St. Louis and quickly established himself as one of the city's premier architects. He earned a reputation not just for talent, but for something equally valuable: reliability. Taylor was known as a man who showed up, who obsessed over details, who wouldn't leave a project until every element met his exacting standards. This work ethic, combined with his distinctive aesthetic, made him the architect of choice for St. Louis's most ambitious projects. His portfolio grew to include some of the city's most prominent buildings. The Mercantile Club building, with its Romanesque arches and refined stonework, became a St. Louis landmark. The Rialto building showcased his ability to blend commercial practicality with architectural grandeur. He even designed the original facade for Union Station Hotel, the massive passenger terminal that would become one of the busiest in America. Each project demonstrated Taylor's range. When Powell Clayton and Richard Cairns came looking for an architect to design their mountaintop resort hotel, Taylor's name rose immediately to the top of their list. They needed a castle that didn't feel like a fantasy, but like an ancient noble estate that had somehow always existed on that mountain. Taylor understood the assignment immediately. He envisioned something that would marry the rugged American landscape with old-world elegance, a building that wealthy travelers from the East Coast would recognize as world-class while still feeling uniquely suited to its Arkansas setting. Clayton and Cairns gave him the resources and the freedom to pursue that vision. Taylor seized it. He would design not just a hotel, but a monument, a limestone palace that would stand as proof of what American ambition could achieve when given the will and the means. The Crescent Hotel would be Isaac S. Taylor's masterpiece. Chapter 4. Construction of the Crescent. In 1884, Powell Clayton's Eureka Springs Improvement Company purchased 27 acres of woodland on the north crest of West Mountain, the highest point overlooking the entire valley. It was a breathtaking sight, but also a brutally difficult one. The land was steep, heavily forested, and accessible only by rough mountain trails. This wasn't going to be just another hotel. This was going to be a statement, a monument, something that would make people stop and ask, how did they possibly build that up here? The first challenge was the stone itself. Taylor had specified White River limestone for the exterior walls, a beautiful material that aged well and reflected light with a warm, golden glow. The problem was that the nearest suitable quarry was located near Beaver, Arkansas, roughly 10 miles away along the White River. The Irish had a centuries-old tradition of working with stone. Their island was covered with it, and they'd built everything from medieval castles to humble cottages, with limestone and granite. The crew that arrived in Arkansas was led by a master mason named O'Shaughnessy, a man whose name would later be recorded in the local newspaper with something approaching reverence. He and his team set up operations at the White River Quarry and began the painstaking work of extracting and shaping the stone that would become the Crescent Hotel. These weren't decorative stones. These were structural elements meant to bear the weight of a 5-story building. The Irish masons worked with hammers, chisels, and an intimate knowledge of how limestone fractures. O'Shaughnessy later told a newspaper reporter that in all his years working stone throughout Ireland and America, he had never encountered limestone of such density and quality. He predicted correctly that it would become a prize building material and that the Crescent's walls would retain their original beauty for generations. The total cost of the project was $294,000, an almost unimaginable sum for the time. To put that in perspective, that amount could have built several dozen standard commercial buildings in St. Louis. But Clayton and Cairns weren't interested in standard. They wanted spectacle, and spectacle required investment. As the Crescent took shape over the course of 1885 and into 1886, it became clear that this was something unprecedented in Arkansas, possibly in the entire region. The limestone walls rose from the mountain like natural stone formations. The rounded Romanesque arches framed windows and doorways. The building looked ancient and permanent, as if it had been perched on that mountaintop for centuries rather than months. But Taylor hadn't just designed a beautiful facade. He'd also insisted on outfitting the interior with every modern convenience available. This was, after all, supposed to be America's most luxurious resort. The Crescent featured Edison electric lamps throughout, a novelty in 1886 when most buildings still relied on gas lighting or candles. A hydraulic elevator carried guests between floors, eliminating the need to climb stairs after long days of travel. Steam heat ran through radiators and open grates, ensuring comfort even during cold Ozark winters. The hotel even featured electric call bells in every room, allowing guests to summon staff with the push of a button. By the spring of 1886, the Crescent Hotel was complete. It rose 5 stories high, crowned West Mountain like a medieval palace, and promised an experience unlike anything else in America. Newspapers across the region published breathless descriptions, calling it a marvel of engineering and design. All that remained was to open the doors and welcome the world inside. Chapter 5. The Grand Opening. On May 1st, 1886, the doors of the Crescent Hotel opened to the public for the first time. The moment had been anticipated for months across the region. Newspapers in St. Louis, Kansas City, and Little Rock had been running advertisements and feature stories about the castle in the air, building expectations to a fever pitch. When guests finally stepped through those massive 9-foot-tall French doors into the lobby, they found themselves in a space designed to overwhelm. 12-foot-tall ceilings stretched overhead, adorned with hand-stenciled lathe and plasterwork. The floors were heart pine, polished to a mirror shine. The walls featured Eureka Springs marble, a local stone with dramatic veining, worked into the fireplace surround, alongside bronze fixtures that gleamed in the light of Edison electric lamps. Every detail announced that this was not merely a hotel, but a palace. This was where the American wealthy came to escape the industrial cities they'd built to play at being European nobility for a week or a month at a time. But the true grand opening, the event that would establish the Crescent's reputation, was scheduled for 2 weeks later. Clayton and Cairns wanted time to work out any operational issues, to train the staff, to ensure that when they hosted their inaugural gala, everything would be flawless. They were planning something ambitious, a banquet and ball that would attract national attention and establish the Crescent as a destination for America's elite. The guest of honor they secured was nothing short of spectacular: James G. Blaine. Blaine was one of the most famous men in America, a former U.S. congressman from Maine, former senator, former Secretary of State under President Garfield. He had been the Republican nominee for president in 1884, losing one of the closest and most controversial elections in American history to Grover Cleveland. The race had been decided by just over 1,000 votes in New York State. Blaine was a kingmaker, a man whose presence at any event conferred legitimacy and prestige. That he agreed to travel to remote Arkansas to attend the opening of a hotel spoke volumes about Clayton's political connections and the expectations surrounding the Crescent. On the evening of May 20th, 1886, 400 guests gathered in what would become known as the Crystal Dining Room for the inaugural banquet. The room was a marvel in itself, 33 feet by 90 feet, with 14-foot-tall ceilings supported by creosoted railroad ties bolted together in a unique structural system that required no center column support. Long tables were set with fine china and crystal, illuminated by chandeliers and the last golden light of sunset streaming through the tall windows. The menu featured dishes designed to showcase both sophistication and local ingredients. Wine flowed freely, sourced from California and imported from Europe. The meal stretched for hours, punctuated by toasts and speeches. Blaine, ever the politician, delivered remarks praising Clayton's vision and the promise of Eureka Springs as a health destination. The entire power structure of post-Reconstruction Arkansas gathered in one room to celebrate what the Eureka Springs Times-Echo would later call America's most opulent resort. The success of that opening night established the hotel's reputation immediately. In the weeks and months that followed, wealthy travelers from across the Midwest and beyond made the journey to Eureka Springs, booking rooms weeks in advance. They came for the springs, yes, but they stayed at the Crescent because it offered something more than just lodging. It offered an experience, a transformation, the chance to escape the modern world into something that felt timeless and grand. For a few golden years, the promise held. The Crescent Hotel was everything Clayton and Cairns and Taylor had envisioned. A castle where American money could buy the illusion of European nobility, where the sick could seek healing, and where the wealthy could retreat from the world they had built. But nothing lasts forever, and the Crescent's first chapter of glory would be shorter than anyone imagined. Chapter 6. The Golden Years. For the next 15 years, the Crescent Hotel existed as a perfect encapsulation of Gilded Age optimism, a place where wealth could buy not just comfort, but transformation. Every morning during the summer season, the scene at the Crescent resembled a painting of European aristocracy transplanted to the Arkansas mountains. Ladies in elaborate riding habits, long skirts designed for side saddles, fitted jackets, veiled hats pinned securely against the mountain wind, would gather near the hotel's stables. The Eureka Springs Improvement Company maintained a stable of over 100 horses specifically for guests. Often, as many as 75 riders would depart on organized morning canters, winding along paths that offered breathtaking views of the valley below. For those less inclined toward riding, there were tally-ho coaches, large open carriages pulled by teams of 4, 6, or even 8 horses, driven by professional coachmen in formal livery. These excursions would carry guests to local attractions: Sanitarium Lake, various spring sites, scenic overlooks where the Ozark landscape stretched to the horizon. It was theater as much as transportation, a way for wealthy visitors to perform their leisure for each other and for the townspeople who watched these displays, with a mixture of admiration and resentment. Back at the hotel, afternoons meant tea dances in the Crystal Dining Room. An in-house orchestra, evenings brought more formal. Dinners, where crab Lorenzo remained the signature dish. The dining experience was designed to rival anything available in New York or Chicago, proof that civilization could flourish even in the remote Ozarks. The guest registry during those golden years read like a directory of American power. Federal judges, senators, railroad magnates, mining entrepreneurs, and their families all made the pilgrimage to Eureka Springs, and when they arrived, the Crescent was where they stayed. To be a guest at the Crescent during this era was to claim membership in an exclusive club. It wasn't just about the accommodations, though those were exceptional. It was about being seen, about participating in a social scene that confirmed your status as someone who mattered. Here, surrounded by limestone walls and mountain vistas, they could simply be lords and ladies on holiday, taking the healing waters and breathing clean air far from the smokestacks of their empires. The promise the Crescent offered was elegantly simple: health, luxury, and natural beauty. You could soak in the supposedly curative mineral springs during the day, dress for dinner in formal evening wear at night, and wake the next morning to mountain air and birdsong. It was an escape from modernity that required all of modernity's infrastructure to function. The Crescent thrived, booking solid through every summer season, attracting guests who returned year after year, who recommended it to friends and business associates. The hotel became synonymous with Eureka Springs itself, the crown jewel of a town built on the promise of healing. But that promise was already beginning to crack. Medical science was advancing rapidly, and faith in spring water cures was starting to seem quaint, even superstitious. The very wealthy who had once flocked to Eureka Springs were finding new destinations. By the early 1900s, the tide was beginning to turn. The Crescent's golden age was ending. What came next would be decades of struggle, adaptation, and eventual transformation into something far darker than anyone in that glittering Crystal Dining Room could have imagined. Chapter 7: Economic Decline and Crescent College. The 20th century arrived with a quiet but devastating threat to places like Eureka Springs: modern medicine. As germ theory gained acceptance and medical science advanced beyond folk remedies, the faith in mineral spring cures began to crumble. Doctors could now explain that most miraculous recoveries at health resorts were simply the result of rest, clean air, and time, not magical properties in the water. X-rays, improved surgical techniques, and the development of aspirin and other pharmaceuticals offered tangible alternatives to bathing in springs. The wealthy sick increasingly turned to hospitals and sanatoriums with actual medical equipment rather than remote mountain resorts promising vague therapeutic benefits. For the Crescent Hotel, the impact was immediate and brutal. Occupancy rates dropped. The summer season that once ran from April through October began shrinking. By the early 1900s, the hotel was struggling to fill rooms even during peak months. The off-season, late fall through early spring, became financially unsustainable. The costs of heating the massive limestone building, maintaining staff, and keeping the amenities running through Ozark winters couldn't be justified when guest rooms sat empty. So, the Crescent began closing for winter. What had been envisioned as a year-round destination became a seasonal operation. Its grand halls darkened and silent for half the year. The hotel couldn't afford to stay open. It could only afford to endure. In 1902, recognizing the declining viability of the resort model, the ownership leased the entire property to the Frisco Railroad for 5 years. But even the Frisco's marketing power couldn't reverse the fundamental shift in American health culture. The healing springs that had drawn thousands in the 1880s now attracted only a fraction of that number. The town that had once boasted 15,000 residents was shrinking, businesses closing, optimism fading. Then, in 1908, a local businessman named A.S. Maddox proposed an unconventional solution. Maddox had previously managed a successful female seminary in Little Rock and understood there was consistent demand for exclusive girls' boarding schools, particularly ones that could offer an isolated, morally supervised environment far from the temptations of urban life. The Crescent Hotel could be perfect for such an institution. And crucially, a school would operate on the opposite schedule from a resort hotel. Students would be in residence from September through June, leaving the building available for hotel guests during the profitable summer months. The Crescent College and Conservatory for Young Women opened in September 1908 with 88 students. Enrollment deliberately kept small to maintain exclusivity. Maddox served as the first president, bringing in a faculty of dedicated teachers who would transform the elegant hotel rooms into dormitories and classrooms. Tuition ran approximately $400 per year, nearly $10,000 in today's currency, which ensured that only daughters of wealthy families could attend. The student body was remarkably diverse for the time, drawing from 39 different states in the first year alone. But the education wasn't just academic. Crescent College operated under a strict moral code designed to shape character as much as intellect. Students wore uniforms to eliminate class distinctions and discourage vanity. Interactions with the outside world were carefully controlled. Correspondence was monitored, visits to town were chaperoned, contact with young men was virtually non-existent. The isolation that made the Crescent a liability as a hotel, these became an asset as a school, allowing administrators to create what they considered a pure environment for female education. The physical education program took advantage of the mountain setting in ways the hotel never had. Some of the graduates went on to remarkable achievements. These women carried their Crescent education into careers that shaped other lives, spreading the influence of those mountaintop years far beyond Arkansas. For 16 years, this dual identity sustained the building. But in 1924, the college closed. The official reason given was lack of interest, lack of funds, and a lack of backing by the citizens. A bitter indictment published in the Eureka Springs Flashlight. The truth was that maintaining a boarding school required constant fundraising and community support, neither of which materialized in sufficient quantity. Maddox and his successor, Richard Ray Thompson, who had served as president for 14 years, simply couldn't raise the money needed to keep operating. The building stood empty through much of the late 1920s. Then, in 1929, the year the stock market crashed and the Great Depression began, a group of concerned citizens managed to reopen it as Crescent Junior College, with A.Q. Burns as president. Against all economic logic, they tried again. But the Depression was merciless. As families lost fortunes, tuition payments became impossible. Students withdrew mid-year, donors disappeared. By 1933, Crescent Junior College was forced to close its doors permanently. All had failed. The building waited, empty and vulnerable, for whatever would come next. What came next was a monster. Chapter 8. Norman Baker. The charlatan arrives. Norman Glenwood Baker was a showman long before his fraudulent treatments would claim over 150 lives. Born in Muscatine, Iowa in 1882, he was the 10th and last child of an inventor father who held 126 patents. Perhaps it was in his blood, the instinct to create, to perform, to convince people that the impossible was within reach. But where his father's inventions served actual purposes, Norman Baker's greatest invention would be himself. He dropped out of high school after his sophomore year and spent his early adult years as a tramp machinist, drifting from job to job. Then he saw a vaudeville magician perform and discovered his calling. Baker organized a traveling show featuring a mind reader he called Madame Pearl Tangley. He toured, learning the rhythms of showmanship, understanding how to read an audience, how to build anticipation, how to make people believe in something that wasn't real. When he returned to Muscatine in 1914, Baker patented the air calliophone, a portable organ run by air pressure that could be heard for a quarter mile. It was a legitimate invention, genuinely useful for outdoor events and publicity. He also ran a correspondence art school and a mail order business. He was becoming a successful small-town entrepreneur, the kind of person who could have lived a comfortable, unremarkable life. Then, in 1925, he got the Chamber of Commerce to sponsor his radio station, KTNT, which stood for Know the Naked Truth. Baker used his radio platform to champion populist causes, attacking big corporations, Wall Street banks, and what he called the medical trust. That's when Norman Baker decided he could cure cancer. The origin was almost absurdly simple. In 1929, Baker met Dr. Charles Ozias, a medical con man who claimed to have a cancer cure. The formula was ridiculous: glycerin, carbolic acid, and alcohol mixed with watermelon seeds, brown corn silk, and clover leaves. There was no science behind it, no mechanism of action, nothing but folk medicine dressed up with medical-sounding terminology. Baker asked for 5 volunteers to try the treatment. All 5 died within a year. Baker covered up the results and declared the cure a success. He purchased the patent to Ozias's formula and opened the Baker Institute in Muscatine. No one with actual oncological training would touch his operation. Baker used his radio station to broadcast testimonials from patients who claimed miraculous recoveries, carefully avoiding mention of the far greater number who died. The money poured in. Desperate cancer patients traveled to Muscatine from across the country, paying enormous sums for Baker's worthless injections. Within a few years, Baker had amassed a personal fortune worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions in today's currency. But his success attracted the attention of Dr. Morris, Fishbein, and the American Medical Association. Fishbein was a crusader against medical quackery, and he recognized Baker as one of the most dangerous frauds in America. In 1932, the Journal of the American Medical Association published a devastating exposé calling Baker exactly what he was: a quack, a faker, and a charlatan. Baker responded by suing the AMA for defamation. He lost the lawsuit spectacularly. Then he lost his bid to become governor of Iowa. State officials began investigating his clinic, and in 1936, Iowa issued a warrant for his arrest for practicing medicine without a license. So Norman Baker fled to Mexico. Baker stayed south of the border until 1937, when he briefly returned to Muscatine. He spent a single day in jail, posted bail, and began looking for a new location to rebuild his empire. He was a social pariah in Iowa, investigated by federal authorities, despised by the legitimate medical community. He needed somewhere remote, somewhere desperate enough to welcome him, despite his reputation. He found Eureka Springs, Arkansas. Norman Baker arrived with his money and his promises of economic revival. The town embraced him. The Chamber of Commerce welcomed him. Local officials looked the other way. They were desperate enough to make a deal with the devil if it meant survival. In July 1937, Baker purchased the Crescent Hotel. The price was never publicly disclosed, but given the building's condition and the town's desperation, he likely paid a fraction of its original value. Baker immediately set about transforming the hotel into his vision of a cancer hospital. He remodeled his first-floor office suite with bulletproof glass and installed a hidden staircase as an escape route. He kept 2 Thompson submachine guns within easy reach. Norman Baker was paranoid, grandiose, and absolutely convinced that the medical establishment was trying to destroy him. His promotional literature was masterfully designed to exploit hope. The pamphlets promised that cancer was curable without surgery, radiation, or X-rays. Just the healing mountain air, good food, exercise, and Baker's special formula. The subtext was clear. The medical establishment wanted to poison you with radiation and cut you apart for profit. But Norman Baker offered a natural cure. Desperate people believed him. The Grand Hotel that had once hosted Gilded Age aristocracy was about to become a site of medical fraud, and Norman Baker would add dozens more names to his tally of victims, names that would linger in those limestone halls long after he was gone. Chapter 9: Suffering and Fraud. The daily routine at Baker's cancer curing hospital followed a script designed to create the appearance of legitimate medical care while delivering nothing but theater and poison. Patients woke at 6 in the morning to a dose of castor oil, standard procedure that Baker claimed helped cleanse the system. At 7, they received a tonic of mysterious composition. Breakfast followed, heavy on raw vegetables and carrot juice, which Baker insisted had anti-cancer properties. Then came the main event. Injections of Formula 5, administered anywhere from 3 to 7 times daily, depending on how much the patient could pay. Formula 5 was Baker's secret weapon, the miracle cure he claimed to have perfected over years of research. The reality was pathetic. Alcohol, glycerol, carbolic acid, ground watermelon seed, corn silk, and clover leaves. There was no active ingredient. It was garden weeds mixed with substances that, in the dosages Baker used, could cause tissue damage and systemic toxicity. The injections were administered directly at tumor sites, a practice that was not only medically worthless, but often extraordinarily painful, especially as the disease progressed. Between injections, patients were encouraged to rest, take in the mountain air, and maintain positive attitudes. Baker was a firm believer in the power of positive thinking, not because it worked, but because it provided a convenient explanation for failure. If a patient didn't improve, it wasn't because the treatment was fraudulent. It was because they hadn't believed hard enough. Some people come here, and they find several ailments that they didn't know they had. That makes it more expensive. This was one of Baker's cruelest tactics. Patients arrived with one diagnosis, desperate for treatment. Baker's staff would discover additional ailments. Tumors that supposedly hadn't shown up on previous examinations, blood conditions, organ weaknesses. Each discovery added to the bill. It was a classic. Con, once the mark has already invested money and hope, you increase the ask, knowing they're too committed to walk away. Patients arrived hopeful, were subjected to worthless and often painful treatments, watched their savings evaporate, and died anyway. But here's the truly monstrous part. As they were dying, Baker forced them to write letters home, claiming miraculous recoveries. Patients in the late stages of their illness, bedridden and suffering, would be visited by Baker's staff and told they needed to write to their families. The letters had to be positive. They had to mention improvements in health, reductions in pain, renewed energy. These testimonials would then be used in Baker's promotional materials, sent to newspapers, and cited in his radio broadcasts from Crescent. When patients finally died, and most did, the deceased were moved quietly to a facility that Baker had installed in the basement of the hotel. The basement had once housed the bowling alley where Crescent College students played during their recreation hours. Now, it held a makeshift morgue with refrigerated storage. According to later estimates, over 150 people died during Baker's 3-year operation. That's roughly 1 death per week, a staggering mortality rate that Baker explained away as patients arriving too late for treatment to be effective. The deceased were removed quietly, usually at night, picked up by local funeral homes, and returned to families who had sent their loved ones to Arkansas believing in Baker's promises. The hotel guests, yes, Baker continued to rent rooms to regular tourists during this period, were generally unaware that people were dying in the building. Baker added theatrical touches that, in hindsight, seem almost incomprehensibly macabre. The lobby featured display cases filled with specimen jars supposedly containing tumors and tissue samples removed from cured patients. Baker would point to these jars as proof of his success, visible evidence that his treatments extracted cancer from the body. Later analysis suggests these were likely pig organs purchased from local butchers, medical school surplus specimens, or tissue samples from autopsies that Baker had no actual involvement in. They were props, nothing more, but they convinced desperate people that Baker's methods produced tangible results. He wore white suits in summer, dark 3-piece suits in winter, always with lavender shirts and a diamond horseshoe stick pin. He drove a custom-painted lavender-cored automobile. In a region still suffering through the Great Depression, where families could barely afford food, Baker flaunted his wealth with grotesque ostentation. But Baker's paranoia wasn't entirely unfounded. The U.S. Postal Inspector's Office had been investigating him since the Mexico years. Federal agents had compiled extensive files on his mail fraud operations, the brochures promising miracle cures, the testimonials from patients who'd actually died, the advertising that violated every truth in advertising statute on the books. They were building a case methodically, waiting for the right moment to move. That moment came in September 1939. On September 1st, the same day Germany invaded Poland and began World War II, federal agents arrested Norman Baker for mail fraud. The charges didn't involve medical malpractice or practicing medicine without a license. They didn't need to prove that his cancer cure didn't work. They simply had to prove that he'd used the U.S. mail system to defraud consumers with false advertising. And that was easy. Baker's own promotional materials were the evidence. The Baker Hospital closed its doors shortly after. His arrest. The patients still in residence, those well enough to travel, were sent home with instructions to continue taking their medicine, which was now just bottles of the worthless formula they could prepare themselves. Those too sick to move were transferred to legitimate hospitals or hospice care, where actual doctors could do nothing but make them comfortable as their illnesses progressed. The Crescent Hotel stood quiet once again, its lobby still painted in garish purple and orange, its basement facility empty, its rooms haunted not by supernatural forces, but by the memory of human suffering inflicted for profit. Norman Baker's mountaintop palace had become a tomb, and the ghosts were just beginning to gather. Chapter 10. Baker's downfall and conviction. The coincidence of dates carries a certain dark poetry. On September 1st, 1939, as German tanks rolled into Poland and plunged Europe into World War II, federal agents arrested Norman Baker in Eureka Springs, Arkansas. The charges were clinical and precise: 7 counts of mail fraud. The federal government wasn't accusing Baker of murder, though that's effectively what he'd committed. They were charging him with the one thing they could prove beyond any doubt: using the United States Postal Service to disseminate fraudulent medical claims. Mail fraud was an elegant prosecutorial choice. It didn't require proving that patients had died because of Baker's treatments, a complex medical argument that could be muddied by expert witnesses and technical disputes. It simply required proving that Baker had made false claims in materials sent through the mail, and that people had sent him money based on those claims. The prosecution had boxes of evidence, brochures promising cancer cures without surgery or radiation. The trial began in 1940 in federal court. Assistant U.S. Attorney Leon Catlett led the prosecution, and he came armed with not just documents but devastating testimony. Former patients, those lucky enough to have survived Baker's treatment, testified about the worthless injections, the false promises, the financial exploitation. Family members of the deceased testified about sending loved ones to Eureka Springs with hope and receiving their remains in return. Local funeral directors testified about the steady stream they had transported from the hotel's basement facility. The defense tried to paint Baker as a misunderstood visionary, a populist hero persecuted by the medical establishment for threatening their monopoly. They pointed to testimonials from patients who claimed improvement, carefully avoiding the fact that most of those patients had died shortly after providing their statements. The jury wasn't buying it. They'd seen the evidence. They'd heard the testimony. They'd looked at the promotional materials promising miracle cures and compared them to the grim reality. The math was simple and brutal. Norman Baker was convicted on all 7 counts of mail fraud. The judge sentenced him to 4 years at Leavenworth Federal Prison in Kansas. It was a relatively light sentence considering the scope of his fraud and the number of deaths connected to his operation, but mail fraud carried statutory limits on sentencing. Baker's lawyers immediately filed appeals, arguing procedural errors and constitutional violations. All were denied. In March 1941, Norman Baker entered Leavenworth to begin serving his sentence. The Baker Hospital closed permanently. Local residents began avoiding the building, claiming it felt wrong, that something terrible lingered in those limestone halls. The ghost stories began almost immediately. Shadowy figures in hallways, sounds of crying from empty rooms, the sensation of being watched. Whether these were genuine supernatural phenomena or simply the psychological weight of knowing what had happened there, the Crescent's reputation as a haunted place was cemented. Baker served his full sentence at Leavenworth. Released in July 1944, he briefly attempted to reopen his Muscatine facility in 1946, but authorities shut him down immediately. No community would welcome him. No bank would loan him money. The con was over. Baker retreated to Florida, living out his remaining years on a 3-story yacht that had once belonged to railroad magnate J. Gould, a final reminder of the Gilded Age fortunes he'd tried to emulate through fraud rather than legitimate enterprise. On September 8, 1958, Norman Baker died. The cause of death was cirrhosis of the liver, a consequence of decades of heavy drinking. But there was another cause listed on the death certificate, one that carries almost unbearable irony: cancer. The man who'd claimed for 20 years that he could cure cancer, who'd sold that lie to thousands of desperate people, died of the very disease he'd pretended to master. If there's justice in the universe, it revealed itself in that final diagnosis. Norman Baker was buried in Muscatine, Iowa. His grave is unmarked by any monument celebrating his achievements, because there were none. His mountaintop palace had become a house of death, and his cure had been poison dressed up in lavender and lies. But the Crescent Hotel itself survived, and the question remained, what do you do with a building that beautiful, that grand, that historically significant, when it's also a monument to suffering and fraud? How do you exorcise those ghosts, or do you simply learn to live with them? Chapter 11. Resurrection and Renovation. In 1946, 4 Chicago businessmen, Herbert A. Byfield, John R. Constantine, Dwight O. Nichols, and Herbert E. Shutter, looked at the abandoned, purple-painted Crescent Hotel and saw possibility where others saw only tragedy. They purchased the property and began the work of restoration, stripping away Baker's garish color scheme, repairing years of neglect, and attempting to return the building to something approximating its original Victorian elegance. On July 4, 1946, the Crescent Hotel reopened with a new slogan that deliberately echoed Baker's own language: a castle in the air, high atop the Ozarks. It was a risky choice, invoking the memory of the fraud years, but it worked. The castle metaphor was too powerful to abandon, and enough time had passed that the Baker Hospital years were beginning to fade into local legend rather than fresh trauma. The new owners partnered with the Frisco Railroad, reviving the old business model that had built Eureka Springs in the first place. Travel vacation packages brought tourists from St. Louis, Chicago, and Kansas City. Families looking for scenic getaways, couples on honeymoons, retirees seeking the mountain air. For 2 decades, the Crescent functioned successfully as a traditional resort hotel, hosting guests who knew nothing of Norman Baker or the bodies that had been stored in the basement. Then, in 1967, disaster struck. Faulty wiring sparked a fire that consumed most of the 4th floor and completely destroyed the penthouse level. The flames tore through the wooden roof structure and the reconstructed interior, leaving the stone towers as blackened shells. It was the most serious structural damage the building had suffered since construction. Reconstruction took years and changed hands multiple times. By 1970, Resort Enterprises, Incorporated had taken over, with Dwight Nichols remaining as the sole original owner. 2 years later, in 1972, a new ownership group led by Dr. and Mrs. Sam H. Corey and Mr. and Mrs. Robert Fegans purchased the property and began systematic restoration in phases. It was during this period that something unexpected began to happen. Reports of supernatural occurrences. Guests claimed to see shadowy figures in hallways. Staff reported hearing voices in empty rooms, feeling sudden cold spots, sensing presences that shouldn't be there. Room 218 became particularly notorious. Guests would report a flirtatious presence, objects moving on their own, the sensation of being watched. Room 419 developed a reputation for mysterious packing and unpacking of suitcases. The stories accumulated, spreading through word of mouth and eventually attracting a new kind of visitor: paranormal enthusiasts. By the late 1970s, the Crescent was marketing itself as America's most haunted hotel. The hotel's identity had shifted fundamentally. It was no longer just a historic property, but a haunted attraction. The tragedy that had nearly destroyed the building's reputation was now its primary draw. The 1980s brought memorable moments that had nothing to do with ghosts. In 1985, Willie Nelson performed a sold-out concert in the Crystal Ballroom. Governor Bill Clinton made appearances at chamber banquets, using the hotel as a venue for political events. The Crescent was becoming woven back into Arkansas's civic life, even as its haunted reputation grew. But the cycles of ownership continued. The Wichita Federal Savings and Loan took possession in 1988, then sold it to Gary and Carol Clausen. Each ownership change brought promises of restoration and renewal, but the building was expensive to maintain, and the seasonal tourism model remained challenging. By the mid-1990s, the Crescent was once again in serious disrepair, leaking roofs, outdated systems, deteriorating infrastructure. The hotel needed more than new owners. It needed someone with vision, resources, and genuine commitment to preservation. Someone who understood that the building's past, including its darkest chapters, was worth saving rather than erasing. In 1997, that someone arrived. Chapter 12. The Ghosts of the Crescent. The ghosts of the Crescent Hotel have names, stories, and favorite rooms. Whether you believe they're genuine spirits or simply the weight of history pressing down on imagination, they've become as much a part of the building's identity as the limestone walls and Romanesque arches. Michael is the most famous. According to legend, he was one of the Irish stonemasons brought over to build the hotel in 1885. He supposedly fell to his death during construction. Now he haunts room 218. Women staying in the room claim to feel invisible hands touching their hair, to wake with the sensation of someone sitting on the edge of the bed, to see a male figure standing in the corner that vanishes when they turn on the lights. There's no historical record of any stonemason named Michael dying during construction, which raises the question, is Michael a genuine spirit or a story that's taken on life through repetition? Either way, room 218 is consistently booked by paranormal enthusiasts hoping for an encounter. Room 419 belongs to Theodora, or perhaps it's more accurate to say, Theodora refuses to leave it. Guests report finding their luggage unpacked or repacked, clothes moved from drawers to the bed, personal items rearranged. Theodora, according to the legend, was a patient in the Baker Hospital years, though whether she died there or later is unclear. Then there's Brecky, the 4-year-old boy who died nearly a century ago, cause unknown, identity uncertain. He allegedly plays in the hallways, particularly near the 4th floor, and has become famous for photobombing tourist pictures. Guests review their vacation photos and discover a child-sized figure in the background, translucent and vague. Whether these are genuine paranormal photographs or tricks of light and shadow, they've become viral sensations on social media, driving more visitors to the hotel. The nurse is less playful. Witnesses describe seeing a woman in an old-fashioned nurse's uniform pushing a gurney down the 3rd-floor hallway, the floor that housed many of Baker's hospital rooms. She never speaks, never acknowledges the living, just continues her eternal rounds caring for patients who are decades dead. Perhaps the most dramatic apparition is the girl in the mist. Witnesses report seeing, always around 10:30 at night, a white figure falling from one of the east side balconies into the gardens below, surrounded by mist or fog even on clear evenings. The story claims she was a Crescent College student who died under tragic circumstances in the early 1900s. There's no historical record confirming such an event, but the sightings persist. Always the same time, always the same balcony. The Crescent has accumulated over a century of deaths, tragedies, and sorrows. College students died of illness in the early 1900s. Guests likely died of natural causes during the hotel's early years. The fire of 1967 could have claimed victims. Any of these could be the source of the hauntings. But it's Baker's era that people remember. Baker's victims who seem most likely to linger in rage and sorrow. Over the past 2 decades, 17 national and international paranormal television shows have featured the hotel. Each brings teams with electromagnetic field detectors, digital voice recorders, infrared cameras, trying to capture scientific evidence of the supernatural. The results are always ambiguous, but the shows have made the Crescent internationally famous as a haunted destination. The nightly ghost tours have become a major revenue stream for the hotel. Guides lead groups through the hallways, into the basement morgue, up to the notorious rooms, recounting the Baker Hospital years and the various ghost legends. It's entertainment, certainly, but there's something deeper happening, a way for visitors to engage with the building's tragic past, to acknowledge the suffering that occurred here without pretending it didn't happen. Then, in February 2019, during excavation for a parking lot expansion, construction crews uncovered hundreds of bottles buried on the edge of the woods behind the hotel. They were specimen jars, the kind used for medical samples. Many still sealed, some filled with liquid ranging from clear to yellow to molasses black. an archaeology team from the University of Arkansas was called in. What they'd found was Norman Baker's midden, his medical waste dump. The bottles matched the ones that had been displayed in the hospital lobby, the fake specimens Baker had used to convince patients his treatments worked. Testing revealed some contained actual human tissue, while others contained animal organs, exactly as suspected. It was Baker's props, his stage dressing for the con, buried and forgotten. The discovery made national news and reignited interest in the hotel's darkest chapter. The specimen jars are now displayed in the hotel's fourth-floor museum. The ghosts of the Crescent Hotel, whether supernatural or psychological, whether Baker's victims or earlier tragedies, serve a purpose. They ensure the building's history isn't sanitized or forgotten. The limestone walls hold their stories, and they're not letting go. Chapter 13, The Ronix and the Modern Restoration. On February 28, 1997, Marty and Elise Ronix stood in the lobby of the Crescent Hotel and made a decision that would define the rest of their lives. The building was in terrible condition, but the Ronix, antique lovers and historic preservationists from Connecticut, saw past the decay to something worth saving. They didn't just want to run a hotel, they wanted to restore a monument, return the Crescent to its 1886 glory, while making it viable as a modern luxury resort. This meant honoring Isaac S. Taylor's original design while incorporating contemporary amenities that guests expected. It meant acknowledging the building's dark history. Most ambitiously, it meant doing all of this while keeping the hotel operational, maintaining revenue streams while simultaneously renovating around paying guests. In May 2000, during a grand garden party held at the hotel's fountain garden, the Ronix publicly announced their restoration plan. They projected a 10-year timeline for complete restoration, a schedule most observers considered optimistic, bordering on delusional given the scope of work required. They completed it in 5 years. The first priority was the 5th floor, the penthouse level that had been destroyed in the 1967 fire and never properly rebuilt. The Ronix hired architects and historical consultants to recreate the original roofline using period photographs and architectural drawings. But the 5th floor wouldn't be guest rooms. The Ronix converted it into their private residence, creating living quarters that allowed them to literally live above the business. It was a statement of commitment. The interior restoration required equally painstaking work. The Ronix brought in Richard Pollard, a master artisan specializing in Victorian decorative painting techniques, to recreate the hand-stenciled patterns that would have adorned the walls in 1886. The result was a dramatic transformation. The building felt authentically Victorian again, elegant without being stuffy, historically accurate without feeling like a museum. Every guest room was renovated, a massive undertaking that meant carefully managing which floors could be rented, while work continued elsewhere. Bathrooms were modernized while preserving historical character. The 19th century room layouts, designed for a very different era of hospitality, were cleverly redesigned to accommodate modern expectations of space and privacy. The limestone sills and lintels were preserved and restored. The original doors and transoms were refinished. Every detail mattered. The Ronix also understood that restoration meant adding to the property's history, not just preserving what existed. In 2002, they constructed 4 jacuzzi suites in the annex building, luxury accommodations that provided revenue to fund ongoing preservation work. In 2008, they added 4 two-bedroom treetop cottages on the hotel's 15-acre property. The conservatory became one of their most successful additions. The original conservatory from the Crescent College years had been demolished decades earlier, but the Ronix rebuilt it in 2004 as a glass-enclosed event space. It immediately became the most sought-after wedding venue in the region, allowing the hotel to capture a lucrative market while honoring the building's educational past. Perhaps most symbolically, they added the New Moon Spa in 2000, occupying the entire garden level of the hotel. The spa directly referenced the original purpose of the Crescent, healing and wellness. But this time, instead of fraudulent cancer cures or mystical spring water, the spa offered legitimate therapeutic services, massage, facials, body treatments. During renovation of the spa space, workers uncovered the old duck bowling lanes from the Crescent College years, which were incorporated into the salon design. Another layer of history made visible. The work didn't go unnoticed. On January 26, 2016, the U.S. Department of the Interior added the Crescent Hotel to the National Register of Historic Places. The designation recognized not just the building's architectural significance, but the Roenick's dedication to authentic preservation. It was official acknowledgement that the Crescent mattered, that it was worth protecting for future generations. Then, in 2009, tragedy struck. Marty Roenick was killed in a car accident. The loss devastated Elise and shook the entire Eureka Springs community. Many wondered if the hotel's restoration would stall, or if Elise would sell this property she and her husband had poured their lives into. Instead, Elise doubled down on Marty's vision. She continued the restoration work, continued improving the property, continued building the hotel's reputation. Her commitment never wavered. Under her sole stewardship, the Crescent became known as the symbol of Arkansas hospitality, a designation earned through consistent excellence and genuine care for both the property and its guests. In November 2022, Historic Hotels of America awarded Elise Roenick the Lifetime Achievement Award for her role in preserving the Crescent. It was recognition of 25 years of dedication. The Roenick's approach to the hotel's complicated legacy has been notably balanced. They haven't downplayed the Baker Hospital years or sanitized the ghost stories. Those are part of the hotel's authentic history. The nightly ghost tours continue. The fourth floor museum displays Norman Baker's specimen jars and tells the full story of his fraud. Paranormal investigation groups are still welcomed, but the haunted reputation no longer defines the property. The Crescent is, first and foremost, a beautifully restored historic hotel that happens to have a dark chapter in its past. Today, the Crescent Hotel offers year-round resort activities, hatchet throwing, outdoor games, nature hikes, mountain biking, history tours, sunrise yoga, wine tastings, watercolor classes. It's evolved beyond a seasonal hotel into a true mountaintop spa resort. The building has survived abandonment, fraud, fire, and neglect. It stands now as proof that historic buildings can be rescued, and that sometimes the best way to honor those who suffered is to ensure their story is never forgotten. Chapter 14. The Legacy. The Crescent Hotel is the last of its kind, the only surviving Grand Springs resort hotel in Arkansas, the final monument to an era when Americans believed salvation could be found in mineral water and mountain air. Hot Springs and Sulphur Springs once had their own palace hotels, structures that rivaled the Crescent in scale and ambition. They're gone now, demolished or burned, victims of changing tastes and economic realities. Only the Crescent remains, standing on its mountain like a limestone testament to both the best and worst of American ambition. Its story is an arc of American history compressed into 140 years. It begins with Gilded Age optimism, the belief that wealth and engineering could conquer nature. Powell Clayton and Richard Cairns looked at a remote mountain and saw opportunity. Isaac S. Taylor looked at that same mountain and saw a canvas for architectural ambition. They built something that wasn't just a hotel, but a statement. Then came the fall, not gradual decline, but spectacular corruption. Norman Baker transformed healing into horror, hope into exploitation. His 3 years at the Crescent represent one of the darkest chapters of medical fraud in American history, a reminder that desperation makes people vulnerable and that monsters often wear respectable clothes. The ghosts that allegedly haunt the building aren't just supernatural phenomena, they're collective memory refusing to let those victims be forgotten. And finally, redemption. The Roenick's quarter-century of restoration work proves that historic buildings can recover from their darkest chapters. The Crescent today is both a luxury resort and a memorial, a place where you can celebrate history while confronting its complications. Isaac S. Taylor's architectural legacy endures in limestone walls that have outlasted the men who commissioned them, outlasted the fraud that corrupted them, outlasted everyone who thought the building should be demolished and forgotten. His vision of permanence has been validated. The stones he specified have proven as enduring as he promised. The Crescent Hotel stands today as many things simultaneously. The easy path would have been to demolish the building after Baker's conviction, to erase the evidence of what happened there. Instead, successive owners chose preservation. The Roenicks chose not just to save the building, but to tell its full story, The grandeur and the suffering, the beauty and the horror, the healing promised and the death delivered. High atop West Mountain, visible for miles, the Crescent Hotel keeps watch over Eureka Springs. The limestone glows golden in Arkansas sunlight. The towers rise against the sky. The halls that once echoed with dying patients' forced testimonials now host weddings and ghost tours and yoga classes. The basement that served as Baker's morgue is now part of a spa. The building holds all its stories. The Crescent Hotel remembers, and in remembering it ensures we do too. The white walls of Shangri-La glow amber in the Hawaiian twilight, catching the last rays of sun as they sink behind Diamond Head. Beyond the estate's fortified perimeter, the Pacific Ocean whispers against volcanic rock. Inside these walls lies one of the most extraordinary collections of Islamic art ever assembled. Tile work from Isfahan, carved cedar wood from Damascus, a 13th century prayer niche worth millions. Paradise by any measure, a sanctuary built for beauty. But on the night of October 27th, 1993, the paradise sits empty. 4,000 miles away, in a bedroom in Beverly Hills that has been converted into an intensive care unit, Doris Duke lies skeletal beneath Egyptian cotton sheets. At 80 years old, the woman once called the richest girl in the world weighs barely 90 pounds. An IV line feeds morphine into her veins, 5 milligrams per hour at 4 o'clock. By 6:30, it's doubled. By 7:30, tripled. By 4 in this morning, 25 milligrams flow through her system every hour. Standing nearby, watching the monitors, is Bernard Lafferty, her butler, her gatekeeper, her sole companion, the Irish immigrant who controls every phone call, every visitor, every decision. The man who stands to inherit $5 million the moment her heart stops beating. Was this mercy, or was this murder? Behind these walls, a $1,200 million fortune hangs in the balance. And somewhere in the morphine-soaked hours of that final night, a question takes shape that investigators will spend years trying to answer. How did a palace built for beauty become a gilded cage? To understand how paradise became prison, we must go back to where it all began. Chapter 1. The Richest Girl in the World. On November 22, 1912, a baby girl was born into unimaginable wealth. Her father, James Buchanan Duke, had built an empire on tobacco and electricity. The morning after his daughter's birth, the New York Times ran a front-page headline that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The richest girl in the world, the $1 million baby. They christened her Doris, but the world knew her as something else entirely, a curiosity, a prize, a walking bank vault. Her father, known as Buck to those close enough to use the name, had transformed North Carolina tobacco farms into a $300 million dynasty. Doris grew up in a gilded prison. Everywhere she went, eyes followed. Reporters tracked her movements. Photographers lurked outside school. Strangers approached with schemes and propositions and desperate pleas. She learned early that most people didn't see her face when they looked at her. They saw dollar signs. The central tragedy of her young life arrived on October 10, 1925. Doris was 12 years old when her father, weakened by pneumonia and years of chronic illness, called her to his deathbed. What he told her in those final moments would shape every decision she made for the next 68 years. Trust no one. A dying man's warning to his only child. And then, he was gone. Buck Duke left. Behind an estate valued at approximately $100 million, a staggering sum in 1925, worth well over $1 billion in today's currency. The estate was split primarily between Doris, her mother, N.A. Naleen, and the Duke University endowment. Doris's share would eventually amount to roughly $80 million, making the 12-year-old one of the wealthiest people in America. The inheritance came in installments, parceled out to protect the young heiress from fortune hunters and her own inexperience. But no amount of careful estate planning could protect her from loneliness. She attended the prestigious Breer-Lee School in New York City, surrounded by the daughters of other wealthy families, yet profoundly isolated. Her classmates knew what she was worth. So did their parents. Every friendship carried the shadow of ulterior motive. Every invitation prompted the question, do they want me or do they want my money? By the time she turned 21 on November 22, 1933, The press descended on the family home like locusts. They wanted photographs, statements, confirmation that the fortune was now officially under her control. The crowds outside East 78th Street grew so thick, so aggressive, that Doris fled to Duke Farms in New Jersey with her mother, Nanaline, and her half-brother, Walker Inman, for a quiet birthday dinner. The scrutiny was suffocating, the expectations unbearable, and her father's warning echoed in every interaction. Then, in February 1935, at 22 years old, Doris made a decision that seemed like escape. She married James Cromwell. He was 37, 15 years her senior, a man of the world. Cromwell moved through high society with practiced ease. He was handsome, worldly, politically ambitious. He'd been married before, had a young daughter, carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd seen more of life than the sheltered tobacco heiress. To Doris, he must have seemed like freedom itself. More importantly, he proposed something that spoke directly to her trapped heart: a honeymoon. Not 2 weeks in Paris or a month on the Riviera, but a real journey, 10 months circling the globe, far from reporters and society columns and the suffocating weight of being the million-dollar baby. She said yes. In early 1935, the newlyweds departed on what would become one of the most consequential journeys of the 20th century. They would travel by ship and train, by car, and even by camel. They would see temples and palaces, mosques and monuments, civilizations that stretched back thousands of years. Doris Duke was finally escaping the prison of her American life. She had no way of knowing that this journey wouldn't free her. It would simply introduce her to a different kind of cage, one she would spend the next 55 years building with her own hands, one whose beauty would ultimately complicate her final years in ways she could never have imagined. Chapter 2. The Journey That Built a Dream. The honeymoon began in the ancient lands where empires rose and fell on shifting desert sands. Doris and James Cromwell departed America in early 1935, their trunks packed for 10 months abroad, their route tracing the edges of the Islamic world. They moved through Palestine and Jordan, where crusader castles stood sentinel over biblical landscapes. They wandered the dusty streets of Cairo, where minarets pierced the sky and the call to prayer echoed 5 times daily. But it was India that changed everything. They arrived in the subcontinent in late winter, planning to spend perhaps a few weeks touring the major cities. Instead, they stayed for 2 months, traveling through the north, transfixed by what they found. This wasn't the buttoned-up world of Newport society or Manhattan dinner parties. This was something else entirely. And then they saw the Taj Mahal. It rose from the banks of the Yamuna River like something conjured from dreams, white marble inlaid with semi-precious stones, perfectly symmetrical, catching light differently with each passing hour. Built by Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan in the 17th century as a monument to his beloved wife Mumtaz Mahal, it represented everything Doris had been searching for without knowing she was searching: beauty as purpose, art as devotion, architecture as frozen poetry. Her husband later wrote that Doris has fallen in love with the Taj Mahal and all of the beautiful marble tile with their lovely floral designs and precious stones. It was more than infatuation. It was awakening. She stood before the marble screens. Jali work, they called it. Perforated stone carved into geometric patterns that filtered light into lace-like shadows. She studied the Spiyai Tra Dora technique, where craftsmen had inlaid carnelian and lapis lazuli into white marble, creating flowers and vines. That seemed to grow from the stone itself. She walked through the Red Fort in Delhi, running her fingers along walls where similar techniques had transformed military architecture into art. For the first time in her life, Doris Duke felt something beyond the weight of her inheritance. She felt possibility. Before leaving India, she made her first major decision as a collector, though she didn't yet know that's what she was becoming. In Delhi, she sought out Francis Blomfield, a noted British architect, whose firm specialized in preserving and recreating Mughal architectural elements. She commissioned him to design an entire suite, bedroom and bathroom, inspired by what she'd seen at the Taj Mahal and the Red Fort. The specifications were exacting: marble panels with inlaid stonework, jolly screens, carved details that echoed the great monuments of the Mughal dynasty. The work would be executed by the Indian marble works in Agra, craftsmen whose families had been working in these traditions for generations. It would take months to complete. The plan was to have everything shipped to El Mira Sol, the Cromwell family mansion in Palm Beach, where Doris and James would settle into married life among Florida's wealthy elite. But fate and the Pacific Ocean had other plans. The Cromwells continued their journey eastward. They traveled through Indonesia, where Hindu and Islamic traditions blended in temple architecture. On August 29th, they sailed into Honolulu Harbor. The plan was simple: 2 weeks in Hawaii, a brief stop to break up the long journey back to the mainland, then home to Palm Beach and the life waiting for them there. Doris stepped off the ship into something she'd never experienced: freedom without scrutiny. Hawaii in 1935 was a territory, not yet a state, a place where the rigid social hierarchies of the mainland seemed to matter less. The air itself felt different, warm, salt-tinged, carrying the scent of plumeria and ginger. The landscape was volcanic drama softened by tropical abundance. And the culture, a blend of native Hawaiian, Asian immigrant, and American influences, operated by different rules than the ones Doris had spent her life trying to escape. More importantly, nobody particularly cared who she was. The Cromwells rented a cottage on Black Point Road, not far from Waikiki, and quickly fell into the company of a remarkable family, the Kahana Moikus. They were Hawaiian royalty of a different sort. With them, Doris learned to surf. She joined them in outrigger canoe races, paddling alongside Sarge and Sam and Bill across waters where ancient Hawaiians had navigated by stars. She attended beach picnics where guitars appeared and voices blended in Hawaiian songs that predated American annexation. 2 weeks became 4. 4 became 8. It was Sam Kahanamoku who showed her the property. He'd heard she was looking, heard that perhaps she might want to stay longer, might want something more permanent than a rented cottage. The plot was 4.9 acres on the Kahala coast, oceanfront land east of Diamond Head, owned by a man named Ernest Woodhouse, who was willing to sell. Sam drove her out to see it. The site was raw, craggy, wind-blasted volcanic rock dropping toward a shoreline where waves broke in endless rhythm. Diamond Head rose to the west, a perfect volcanic profile. To the east, the coastline curved toward Coco Head and eventually Makapuu Point. Dense vegetation could provide privacy. The ocean stretched to the horizon, unobstructed by anything except possibility. Doris stood on that rocky promontory and made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She wouldn't build in Palm Beach. She wouldn't return to the suffocating social obligations of the mainland, the endless scrutiny, the feeling that every room she entered was filled with people calculating her net worth. She wouldn't install the Mughal marble suite in her husband's family mansion, living under his mother's watchful eye. She would build here, in Hawaii, her own house, on her own terms. In April 1936, she purchased the land from Ernest Woodhouse. The price was $100,000, substantial but meaningless against the scale of her fortune. What mattered wasn't the cost. What mattered was the possibility. Sam Kahanamoku received a 5% finder's fee. Her husband James, according to later accounts, vowed he wouldn't pay another penny of Doris's money for the project, already sensing perhaps that this Hawaiian dream was pulling his young wife away from the life he'd imagined for them. But the vision was forming, crystallizing with the clarity of light through marble screens. She would build a modern house, clean lines, simple structure, a blank canvas. And on that canvas, she would layer the art and architecture of the Islamic world. The Mughal marble from India, elements from Morocco, from Persia, from Syria and Egypt, and anywhere else beauty had been carved into stone, or woven into textiles, or fired into ceramic. She didn't know yet how the story would end. She only knew that, for the first time since her father died, she felt something like hope. Chapter 3, Building Paradise. With land secured and vision crystallizing, Doris Duke needed an architect who could translate dreams into structure. She chose Marion Sims Wyeth, a decision that revealed how clearly she understood what she wanted, and more importantly, what she didn't want. Wyeth was what they called a society architect. Born in New York, trained at Princeton and the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, he'd established his practice in Palm Beach, where he designed homes for the wealthy in whatever style they desired. Colonial revival one month, Mediterranean revival the next, modernist when the mood struck. Critics would later dismiss him for lacking a signature style, for being too willing to bend to clients' wishes. But that's exactly why Doris hired him. She didn't want an architect who would impose his vision on her project. She wanted someone who would listen, adapt, and ultimately step aside. Just as important was Wyeth's supervising architect, Drew Baker. While Wyeth worked from his Palm Beach office, Baker would be on site in Honolulu throughout construction. What emerged was essentially modernist architecture at its most spare: clean lines, flat roofs, white stucco walls, minimal ornamentation. It was, quite deliberately, a blank canvas. The design philosophy was radical in its simplicity. Let the structure be neutral, and let Islamic art provide the beauty. The walls would be plain white so that tile work could explode in color against them. The interiors would be open and flexible so that carved wood screens could define and redefine spaces. The architecture would serve the collection, not compete with it. Construction began in earnest in 1936, with over 200 workers eventually employed on the site. The basic structure rose quickly, 14,000 square feet for the main house, plus a separate structure called the Playhouse that would serve as guest quarters. But this was only the skeleton. The real work, the transformation from modern architecture into Islamic-inspired paradise, required Doris to travel. In May 1937, with construction underway, the Cromwells departed on a 2-month trip to Europe, including one crucial week in Morocco. If India had been Doris's awakening to Mughal architecture, Morocco became her introduction to North African Islamic traditions. White facades, intricate tile work, carved plaster, rooftop pavilions, courtyard gardens hidden behind fortress-like walls. In Rahbat, they found Rune Martin Workshop. Martin ran one of the most respected traditional craft workshops in Morocco, employing master craftsmen, mahallams, whose families had been working in these techniques for generations. The workshop could produce everything from carved cedar ceilings to Zeelige tile work to colored glass windows set in plaster screens. Doris and James commissioned extensively. They ordered 2 large carved cedar ceilings, one for the foyer, one for the living room. They commissioned massive wooden doors carved in traditional Moroccan patterns. They ordered plaster friezes, archways, colored glass windows. They requested an enormous wooden screen, a mashrabaya, that would shield the central courtyard from the foyer, allowing glimpses without full exposure. Martin's craftsmen worked through the following year, carving and assembling, creating new pieces based on traditional designs. Photographs from the workshop show ma'alams posed with their work, older. Men with decades of experience, younger apprentices learning techniques passed down through families. Their names, tragically, were never recorded. The Moroccan Commission would define the sensory experience of entering Shangri-La: the carved ceiling overhead, the colored light filtering through glass, the geometric screen promising beauty beyond. But it was only one layer of what Doris was building. By late 1937, she was planning another trip, this time a 6-week tour of the Middle East, with Iran as the primary focus. This wouldn't be a honeymoon's leisurely wandering. This would be research, documentation, and acquisition on a scale that transformed Doris from enthusiastic collector into serious patron. She and James departed in March 1938, bringing along Mary Crane, a graduate student at NYU's Institute of Fine Arts who'd worked on architectural surveys in Iran. Crane would prove invaluable, helping Doris understand what she was seeing, connecting her with dealers and craftsmen, negotiating purchases. Their destination was Isfahan, the jewel of Safavid Persia, where 17th century Shahabaz I had built a capital city, designed to showcase Islamic architecture at its most glorious. The centerpiece was the Shah Mosque, fronting the great public square, the Maidan. Doris and James spent days there, photographing every detail, filming the facade and interior, studying how light moved across tile work, how geometric patterns interlocked, how calligraphy and floral motifs combined into compositions of breathtaking complexity. Through contacts arranged before the trip, they met EU Bravo, an art dealer based in Tehran with connections to Isfahan's traditional tile workshops. Doris commissioned what would become the largest single artistic element at Shangri-La, a massive tile mosaic for the main courtyard, patterned after the Shah Mosque entrance. Bravo assembled a workshop of tile makers in Isfahan. Photographs he later sent to Doris show the full scope of the operations. They also produced tile work for the playhouse exterior, for archways, for decorative panels throughout the property. The Isfahan tile makers were creating new work using centuries-old techniques. While in Isfahan, Doris and Mary Crane also studied another monument, the Chehel Sotun, a royal pavilion built in 1647. It stood at the edge of a reflecting pool, supported by tall wooden columns, with a covered portico providing shade while opening completely to the outdoors. They photographed it extensively, measured proportions, studied how the columns multiplied in reflection. This would become the model for Shangri-La's Playhouse. Back in Honolulu, Drew Baker received Doris's photographs, measurements, and instructions, transformed the blank structure planned for the guest house into something inspired by the Chehel Sotun, columns, covered portico, a relationship with water. But adapt it, make it work for Hawaii for modern use, for a 75-foot swimming pool instead of a reflecting pond. Throughout 1938 and into 1939, shipping crates arrived at Honolulu Harbor, carved cedar from Morocco, marble screens from India, tiles from Isfahan. Each arrival brought new challenges for Baker. The Moroccan ceiling didn't quite fit the foyer as originally planned. Adjustments, modifications. The marble jolly screens commissioned in India arrived broken. Disaster turned opportunity. Instead of discarding the shattered pieces, Baker designed a rooftop pavilion specifically to incorporate the broken screens, cutting them down, reinforcing them, creating an airy outdoor space from what might have been thousands of dollars of waste. This was the reality of Shangri-La's construction. Constant problem solving, creative adaptation. Drew Baker working closely with Doris to integrate her vision with the practical requirements of building in Hawaii's climate and with materials shipped from around the world. In 1940, Doris made perhaps her single most significant acquisition. Through negotiations with dealer Hagop Kevorkian, she purchased a 13th century mihrab, a prayer niche, from Verahmin, Iran. Standing nearly 13 feet tall, signed by master artist Ali ibn Muhammad ibn Abi Tahir, and dated 1265 AD, it was one of only 6 surviving mihrabs from the peak of Persian luster production. Kevorkian initially entertained offers from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but Doris's determination and Mary Crane's persistent negotiation won out. The mihrab would become Shangri-La's spiritual and aesthetic anchor, placed in the prominent arched doorway connecting the living room to what would be called the mihrab room. On Christmas Day, 1938, Doris and James moved into Shangri-La. It wasn't finished. Construction would continue for months, with Drew Baker still on site solving problems, adjusting details, implementing Doris's evolving ideas. But enough was complete to occupy, to begin living with the art, to see how light moved through spaces at different times of day. The total cost was approximately $1.4 million, making it the most expensive private residence ever constructed in Hawaii to that point. But the expense wasn't about displaying wealth. Every dollar served the vision. The name came last. Initially, Doris had called it Hale Kapu, Forbidden House in Hawaiian, but by June 1938, references in correspondence show they had renamed it Shangri-La, after the mythical hidden valley in the enormously popular 1937 film Lost Horizon. For Doris Duke, standing in her unfinished paradise as the world tilted toward World War II, the name must have felt like prophecy. She had built her Shangri-La, a place where beauty lived, where privacy reigned, where she controlled who entered and who remained outside the walls. She couldn't know how the decades ahead would unfold, or how the sanctuary she'd created would shape the final chapters of her life. Chapter 4, Paradise Found. Johnny Gomes met Doris Duke the first day she arrived in Hawaii in 1935. He was still living at Shangri-La when she died in 1993. When asked about the estate during those nearly 60 years, he said something that captured the essential truth of Doris's relationship with her paradise. There was no such word as finished. Shangri-La was never complete because Doris was never complete. The house became an extension of her restless imagination, her evolving taste, her endless pursuit of beauty. Where other collectors acquired and displayed, Doris acquired and integrated, constantly rearranging, reconsidering, tearing out, and rebuilding. The house was alive because she kept it alive. In the early years, life at Shangri-La bore little resemblance to what it would eventually become. She spent her days with the Kahanamoku Ohana, the family who'd first shown her what Hawaii could be. With Sam and Sarge and their wives, she paddled outrigger canoes across waters that had carried Hawaiian voyagers for centuries. She surfed at breaks where Duke Kahanamoku had first demonstrated to the world what riding waves could be. She attended beach picnics at Makapu Peninsula, at Mahkua on the west side, places where guitars appeared naturally and voices blended in Hawaiian harmonies that predated everything America had brought to the islands. In photographs from this period, she looks genuinely happy. Not the posed society smile of her debutante years, but something unguarded. Sand in her hair, casual clothes, surrounded by people who valued her for reasons that had nothing to do with her bank account. The contrast with her mainland life couldn't have been sharper. In New York, she was always the million-dollar baby, always watched, always judged. In Hawaii, behind Shangri-La's walls, she was simply Lai Lai Lei, the name the Kahanamoku family gave her, meaning delicate or fragile. They saw something in her that the society pages never captured. But paradise couldn't protect her from everything. Her marriage to James Cromwell deteriorated steadily. He had political ambitions. He'd served briefly as U.S. ambassador to Canada. That required exactly the kind of public life Doris had fled to Hawaii to escape. He wanted a traditional wife who would host dinners and attend functions and smile for cameras. She wanted to surf and collect Islamic art and live on her own terms. In 1943, they divorced. She was 31 years old. The divorce was civilized by the standards of wealthy Americans, meaning expensive lawyers handled everything, and the public statements were carefully worded. But it confirmed something Doris had perhaps known since her father's deathbed. Relationships were transactions, and eventually everyone wanted something. She kept Shangri-La. That was never in question. It was hers, her land, her vision, her refuge, and she kept building. Throughout the 1940s and 50s, shipping crates continued arriving from dealers in Cairo, Damascus, Tehran, Istanbul. Each acquisition prompted questions. Where does this belong? What needs to move? What needs to change? The living room underwent multiple transformations. Spanish tiles were installed vertically above the fireplace, then removed and reinstalled horizontally when she acquired an antique Spanish mantel. Furniture arrangements shifted with each new textile acquisition. The Chinese Guan Yin sculpture that originally occupied the arched space where the great mihrab now stands was eventually sent to Duke Farms in New Jersey. In the 1960s, Doris turned her attention to the dining room. Originally, it had featured a marine motif, appropriate for an oceanfront property. Glass fishing floats hung from nets. Built-in saltwater aquariums lined the walls. Coral and shells decorated surfaces. Furniture carried sea motifs. She ripped it all out. What replaced it was something entirely different, a tented interior that transformed the room into an Arabian Nights fantasy. Egyptian and Indian textile appliques hung on the walls, their colors blazing against white plaster. She installed an enormous Bakhara crystal chandelier from the 1840s, made specifically for export to the Middle East, its prismatic light scattering across surfaces. An Indian bed was converted into a dining table, and on the east wall, one of the massive Isfahan tile mosaics commissioned in 1938 finally found its permanent home. The effect was theatrical, sumptuous, completely divorced from the ocean view just beyond the windows. She had created a space that could exist anywhere. Hawaii disappeared inside the tent. This fascination with tented interiors had deep roots for Doris. She'd commissioned an actual tent from dealers in Damascus years earlier. The playhouse had originally featured a tented ceiling design. Tent panels and appliques kept appearing in her acquisitions. There was something about the temporary made permanent, the nomadic made architectural, that spoke to her. Perhaps because she'd spent her life moving between residences, New York, New Jersey, Newport, Hawaii, later Beverly Hills. Never quite settling, always temporary even in houses she owned. The tent was honest about its impermanence in a way mansions never could be. But in 1965, at the age of 52, Doris made a decision that suggested she was thinking about permanence in a new way. She added a codicil to her will, establishing what would eventually become the Doris Duke Foundation for Islamic Art. The language was clear. Shangri-La would be maintained after her death for the study and understanding of Islamic art and culture. It was a remarkable vision. Decades before her death, she was already imagining Shangri-La as something beyond a private residence. An educational center, a place where scholars could study the collection, where people could learn about Islamic arts and cultures, where beauty could serve a purpose larger than her own enjoyment. Her friend Emma Veary, the beloved Hawaiian singer, witnessed the codicil. Doris trusted Emma with this glimpse into her plans for the future, a future where Shangri-La would outlive her, where the walls would finally open to let the world inside. But opening to the world after death meant continuing to perfect it while alive. The 1980s brought the most ambitious renovation Shangri-La would ever see: the Syrian Room. Doris was in her 70s now, but her acquisitive energy hadn't diminished. She'd purchased elements from a 19th century Damascus Kahaha reception room from an aristocratic Syrian home through Hagop Kevorkian's collection at NYU. The components were spectacular, carved and painted Ahyameh woodwork with metal leaf embellishments, inlaid stone blocks, marble floor tiles, painted ceilings, doors, niches. But they came from a room with different proportions, different ceiling heights, different spatial logic than anything at Shangri-La. No matter, Doris would make it fit. She ordered the removal of the billiards room, a bathroom, and an office. Workers lowered the floor and raised the ceiling. The goal was to recreate, as closely as possible, the experience of being in an actual Damascus reception room from the 1800s. The result was museum quality, a period room that transported visitors to another time and place. The Ajami ceiling glowed with painted patterns and gilding. The marble fountain, Mahsab, sat exactly where it would have in Damascus. The raised seating area, Tazar, invited you to recline on cushions as Syrian aristocrats once had. But here's what was telling: Doris rarely used it. The Syrian room was designed for display, not living. It faced the central courtyard as Damascus rooms traditionally did, but it deliberately isolated itself from the ocean views that characterized the rest of Shangri-La. You entered it and left Hawaii behind completely. It was historically accurate in a way that made it fundamentally different from every other space in the house. She was increasingly a curator, preparing an exhibition, a preservationist safeguarding artifacts, a benefactor building an institution. She still lived at Shangri-La, still entertained occasionally in the tented dining room, still swam in the playhouse pool, but more and more, she moved through the spaces as a guardian rather than an inhabitant. Friends noticed the change. The house felt less like a home and more like a shrine. The focus on perfection, on period accuracy, on museum-quality presentation, it served the future institution she'd written into her will, but it made the present lonelier. By the 1980s, many of the Hawaiian friends from those early joyous years were gone. The Kahanamoku brothers had passed away. The surf sessions and beach picnics belonged to a different era, a different Doris. She was still one of the wealthiest women in the world. Her fortune had grown to well over $1 billion. She still traveled, still acquired art, still renovated and reimagined spaces at Shangri-La. But the walls that had once protected her paradise were beginning to feel confining. And the person she would eventually trust to manage those final years, the person whose presence would transform those walls from protection into prison, was about to enter her life. His name was Bernard Lafferty, and he was waiting in the wings. Chapter 5, The Daughter Who Wasn't. Loneliness was the one thing Doris Duke's fortune could never fix. 2 marriages had ended in divorce. First James Cromwell in 1943, then tobacco heir Porfirio Rubirosa in 1948 after just 1 year. In 1940, she'd given birth to a daughter who lived less than 24 hours, a tragedy she rarely spoke about but never forgot. Her mother, Nanaline, died in 1962. Her half-brother, Walker Inman Jr., struggled with his own demons before his death in 1991. The Kahanamoku brothers, who'd given her such joy in those early Hawaiian years, were gone by the 1980s. At 72 years old, Doris Duke had $1 billion fortune, 4 palatial residences, one of the world's finest collections of Islamic art, and almost no one who loved her for reasons that had nothing to do with what she was worth. Then, in 1984, she met Chandi Hefner. It happened in Hawaii, appropriately, the one place where Doris had always felt something close to freedom. Hefner was 32 years old, roughly half Doris's age, a follower of Hare Krishna, who'd rejected her middle-class Baltimore upbringing for communal farm living. They were introduced through mutual friends, and something clicked immediately. They shared a passion for dance. Doris had studied dance religiously throughout her life, taking lessons well into her 60s. Hefner was trained in classical Indian dance forms. They could talk for hours about movement. They shared an interest in Eastern philosophy. While Doris had approached Islamic art as an aesthetic pursuit rather than a religious one, she'd always been drawn to non-Western ways of understanding the world. Hefner's immersion in Krishna consciousness, her vegetarianism, her meditation practice. These weren't exotic to Doris. They were intriguing, and they shared a love of animals. Doris kept camels at Duke Farms. She'd funded wildlife protection causes for years. Hefner's commitment to animal welfare and her obvious genuine affection for creatures great and small touched something in the older woman. But more than any shared interest, Hefner offered something Doris had been missing for decades: uncomplicated companionship, or so it seemed. Peggy Lee, the legendary singer and Doris's longtime friend, later said, "She always wanted a daughter. Chandi filled an empty spot in Miss Duke's life." In 1985, Hefner moved into Duke Farms in New Jersey, the 2,700-acre estate where Doris had fled on her 21st birthday to escape the crowds. Having Hefner there made the massive property feel less empty. In 1986, Doris purchased a $1.5 million horse ranch for Hefner in Oahu, not far from Shangri-La. The gesture was extravagant, but not unusual for Doris. She'd always been generous with people she cared about, funding projects and causes that mattered to them. They traveled together, Europe, Asia, destinations that combined Doris's collecting interests with their shared cultural curiosities. Doris paid for everything naturally. She'd always been the one paying. But with Hefner, it felt different. It felt like having family again. At some point during this period, Hefner introduced Doris to Bernard Lafferty. He was born in County Down, Ireland, orphaned at 17. He'd emigrated to Philadelphia and worked his way up through hotels and theaters, eventually becoming a personal assistant. He'd worked for Peggy Lee. That's how Hefner knew him. He was soft-spoken, deferential, presentable in the way that good domestic staff must be. Doris hired him as a butler. It seemed like a minor decision at the time. By 1987, Hefner's influence over Doris's life was expanding beyond companionship into business affairs. She persuaded Doris to fire her longtime business manager and replace him with Irwin Bloom, a New York accountant. That same year, Doris drafted a new will naming Hefner as executor. The message was clear. Hefner wasn't just a friend anymore. She was being positioned as Doris's heir apparent, the person who would manage the fortune and make decisions about the future. In 1988, Doris made it official. She legally adopted Chandi Hefner as her daughter. At 75 years old, Doris Duke finally had the child she'd lost 48 years earlier. For perhaps the first time in decades, Doris wasn't alone. The illusion lasted about a year. In 1989, Hefner began a romantic relationship with James Burns, one of Doris's bodyguards. The relationship itself wasn't necessarily the problem. Doris had never been prudish about such things. The problem was what it represented: divided loyalty. The moment she sensed that someone's attention was elsewhere, her suspicion grew. Hefner's behavior shifted after the adoption. Staff members noticed it immediately. The woman who'd been friendly and deferential suddenly became imperious, giving orders, acting as if her adopted status conferred authority over the household. Other staff members complained about her bossiness, her presumption, her increasingly difficult personality, and they complained to Doris. By early 1991, Doris's affection had curdled into suspicion. In February 1991, she ordered her lawyer to tell Hefner to leave. They never saw each other again. But the paranoia didn't end with Hefner's departure. It intensified. Doris told staff members that she believed Hefner had poisoned her. Doris ordered tests run on food and sherry at Shangri-La, searching for evidence of toxins. None were found. But the absence of physical evidence did nothing to dispel Doris's conviction. In her mind, the betrayal was complete. Hefner had been manipulating her way into the will, and then, when Doris became inconvenient, trying to speed her death. Whether any of this was true didn't matter. What mattered was that Doris believed it. the psychological impact was devastating. She was 78 years old now, increasingly frail and more isolated than she'd been in decades. The Hawaiian friends were gone, her mother was gone, her half-brother was dying, and the one person she'd tried to make family had, she believed, tried to kill her. Colin Shanley returned to work for Doris in March 1991, a few weeks after the Hefner expulsion. He barely recognized his employer. In 1989, when he'd quit because of Hefner, Doris had been a vibrant older woman who swam laps daily, who moved through Shangri-La with energy and purpose. Now, the paranoia about poisoning had extended to her eating habits. She was consuming less, withdrawing into herself. The expulsion of Chandi Hefner created a void in Doris Duke's life, a void that needed filling. She needed someone she could rely on. Lafferty had been working as her butler for years by this point. Quiet, deferential, always present, but never intrusive. He knew how she liked her tea. He knew which rooms she preferred at different times of day. He knew her habits, her schedules, her preferences. And crucially, he'd been introduced to her by Hefner. But he'd stayed loyal to Doris when Hefner left. That loyalty, whether real or performed, was exactly what Doris needed to see. In the wake of the Hefner disaster, Lafferty's role began to expand. The void was being filled by someone who understood exactly how to use it. Chapter 6, The Butler's Ascent. When Colin Shanley returned to work in March 1991, he barely recognized his employer. In 1989, when he'd quit because of Chandi Hefner, Doris had been 76 but vital, swimming laps in the Playhouse pool every morning, moving through the estate with purpose and energy. The woman he saw now looked skeletal. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor. Her eyes seemed distant, clouded. She was frail, Shanley would later testify. Very frail. But the most dramatic change wasn't Doris's appearance. It was Bernard Lafferty's role. A traditional butler occupies a strange position in wealthy households, simultaneously invisible and essential. They manage the smooth operation of daily life while remaining in the background. That's what Lafferty had been from the mid-1980s until early 1991. After Hefner's expulsion, everything changed. Lafferty wasn't just serving tea anymore. He was deciding who got to sit down to drink it. He wasn't just answering the phone. He was screening every call, deciding which ones reached Doris and which ones didn't. He was giving staff orders, claiming to speak for Miss Duke, positioning himself as the sole conduit to their employer. Ann Bostitch, who worked as Doris's housekeeper in Beverly Hills, later testified, "He made it clear that everyone had to go through him first to speak to Miss Duke about anything. Friends who'd known Doris for decades found themselves unable to reach her. Phone calls went unanswered, messages disappeared. Family members experienced the same barriers. Walker Inman, Doris's half-nephew and closest living relative, found it increasingly difficult to make contact. The isolation was systematic. Each individual restriction seemed reasonable. Miss Duke is tired. Miss Duke doesn't want to be disturbed. Collectively, they amounted to near complete control over her access to the outside world. And as Lafferty's control increased, so did his influence over Doris's legal decisions. Between 1991 and 1992, Doris changed her will 3 times. In the spring of 1991, she named Dr. Harry Demopoulos and Chemical Bank as co-executors. By November, that had changed. Irwin Bloom became executor. By April 1992, another codicil. Lafferty appeared as co-executor alongside Walker Inman. 3 wills in 13 months, each one reducing the circle of trust, each one elevating someone new, and Lafferty was ascending. The spring of 1992 also brought the medical disasters that would begin Doris Duke's final descent. At 79, she decided she wanted a facelift. She sought out Dr. Harry Glassman, a well-known Hollywood plastic surgeon. The procedure itself went smoothly. 2 days later, Doris fell out of bed and broke her hip. At her age, the fracture carried serious mortality risk. She was rushed to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, where emergency surgery repaired the break. Glassman recommended she see Dr. Charles Kivowitz, an internist. This was where professional boundaries began to blur. Throughout the summer of 1992, Glassman and Kivowitz became regular visitors at Doris's Beverly Hills home. They didn't just make house calls. They stayed. They socialized. Staff members observed them arriving in the late afternoon, opening bottles of expensive champagne that Doris provided freely. They'd sit with her for hours, drinking, talking, the relationship evolving from doctor-patient into something that looked more like friendship. Doris grew especially fond of Dr. Glassman. There's a reason medical ethics emphasize maintaining professional boundaries. When doctors become friends, objective clinical judgment becomes difficult. And when a patient is worth over $1 billion, the temptations multiply further. By the fall of 1992, Doris had decided on another surgery, a double knee replacement. Her stated reason was that she wanted to dance again. Dr. Kivowitz advised against it. So did Eleanor Lawson, her longtime dance teacher. The risks were enormous, Doris insisted. Who could tell her no? She'd spent her entire life having her decisions executed without question. The pattern was now established. Doris Duke, increasingly isolated from old friends and family, was surrounding herself with new people who'd entered her life recently. Lafferty controlled access to her. Glassman and Kivowitz provided medical care that had evolved beyond professional. All three stood to benefit from their position in her life. In January 1993, Doris underwent the double knee replacement at Cedars-Sinai. The operation was technically successful, but she returned to recuperate, carried from the plane to the house where she'd once run freely, where she'd swum laps every morning. Now she could barely walk, and the medications that would cloud her final months had begun to flow. Chapter 7. The Prescription Trap. Pain management after major orthopedic surgery requires powerful drugs. Percodan, a combination of oxycodone and aspirin, became part of her daily regimen. When that wasn't enough, Demerol, a strong opioid that can cause confusion even at therapeutic doses. But they weren't alone. She was also taking sleeping pills, multiple types, because one wasn't working anymore, antidepressants. She continued drinking wine daily, and she was still taking laxatives, a habit from her younger years that had become increasingly dangerous. The combination was staggering. Each medication interacted with the others in ways that multiplied their effects. The cumulative impact on a 79-year-old woman was severe. Colin Shanley, watching her during those weeks, later testified, she did not know where she was or what day it was. She would wake thinking she was in a different house, in a different decade. She'd ask for people who'd been dead for years. The woman whose mind had been sharp enough to build $1 billion art collection, to negotiate with dealers across 3 continents, that woman was disappearing into a fog of prescription medications. Lafferty was there constantly, managing her care, controlling who saw her and when. By late February 1993, the situation had become critical. Doris was severely malnourished and dangerously dehydrated. She was flown emergency back to Los Angeles and admitted to Cedars-Sinai. Hospital records told a concerning story. Nurses noted she was intermittently disoriented and confused. She hallucinated, once insisting she was in a noisy apartment in Brooklyn. On March 2nd, a staff neurologist named Dr. Clark Espy examined her. His report: Doris suffered from mild delirium, possibly exacerbated by prescription drugs. When medications were reduced, nurses noted improvement. She had periods of clarity, windows of lucidity surrounded by clouds of disorientation. It was during one of those windows that the final, legal changes occurred. In early March, while hospitalized, Doris asked Dr. Glassman, the plastic surgeon who'd been socializing with her for months, if he could recommend a lawyer, not calling her longtime attorney, not reaching out to legal firms she'd worked with for decades, asking her plastic surgeon. Glassman connected her with Alan Kroll, a neighbor. Kroll referred her to William Doyle Jr. at Catton, Muchin, and Zavis, a large Chicago firm. Doyle flew from Chicago the next day. Doris wanted to replace Irwin Bloom as executor with Bernard Lafferty. She told Doyle that Bloom had lost his sense of territory, had violated the cardinal sin of somehow thinking that he had become Mr. Duke. Doyle pointed out Lafferty's lack of education. Doris dismissed the concern. She told me that he wasn't college educated, but nor was she. He had been by her side 24 hours a day for 6 years. He was intimately familiar with her view of life. On March 9, 1993, Doris Duke signed the new codicil. She was so weak that William Doyle had to guide her hand as she wrote. Witnesses watched as the lawyer physically helped her form the signature. Doyle later admitted he knew there would be legal challenges. It was clear she was disinheriting her daughter. Any third grader would realize this was going to be a contested estate. But knowing a will would be contested didn't stop him from executing it. Bernard Lafferty was now sole executor. He would receive a $5 million executor's fee upon Doris's death, plus $500,000 annually for the rest of his life. Doris was released from Cedars-Sinai on April 15th. The pattern of confusion continued. In July 1993, she insisted on another knee operation. Dr. Kievowitz advised against it. 2 days after being sent home, she had a massive stroke. She returned to Cedars-Sinai for 2 months. The damage was significant, her mobility severely limited, her cognitive function further impaired. On September 20th, 1993, she was sent home for the final time. Her bedroom at the Beverly Hills house was converted into an intensive care unit, 2 nurses on duty around the clock. A stomach tube provided nutrition. A tracheotomy tube assisted with breathing. This wasn't recovery, this was end-of-life care. And standing in that room, controlling access, managing the nurses, making decisions, was Bernard Lafferty, the man who now controlled every aspect of her existence, the person who stood to inherit millions the moment her heart stopped beating. Shangri-La, the paradise built to be a refuge from the world, stood empty across the Pacific, its tiles gleaming in Hawaiian sunlight. Doris Duke would never see it again. She had 5 weeks left to live. Chapter 8. The Final Days. The bedroom now looked like any hospital room. Medical monitors lined the walls. IV stands clustered around the bed. Doris Duke controlled nothing. She couldn't eat without a tube. She couldn't breathe without assistance. She couldn't move from her bed. On October 7th, 1993, she told Dr. Kievowitz that she didn't want to continue living if her health couldn't improve. The knees that were supposed to let her dance again would never support her weight. At 80 years old, after multiple surgeries and a devastating stroke, there was no path forward. The next day, October 8th, Dr. Kievowitz issued an order. Take no special measures to keep her alive. Heavy sedation began. Medical records show a significant increase in pain medications and sedatives. The stated reason was comfort. But the medications did more than provide comfort. They clouded consciousness, suppressed breathing, made communication difficult or impossible. While Doris lay dying, Lafferty was spending her money. In October 1993 alone, he charged $20,000 to Doris's credit cards, mostly on clothing for himself. Large gifts were also being distributed, allegedly authorized by Doris through Lafferty. Dr. Glassman received $500,000. Dr. Kievowitz received $10,000 in addition to his regular medical fees. Both gifts authorized by a woman who was heavily sedated, barely conscious, and, according to multiple witnesses, incapable of making coherent decisions. On October 26th, Dr. Kievowitz made another decision: stop the feeding tube and discontinue supplemental oxygen. Without nutrition, the body begins to shut down. Without extra oxygen, breathing becomes more labored. These were the final steps before death. October 27th, 1993, began with visitors. That morning, Dr. Kievowitz arrived at the Beverly Hills house, along with Dr. Glassman and William Doyle, the Chicago lawyer who'd guided Doris's hand to sign the March codicil. 3 men who'd entered her life recently, all of whom had financial interests in her estate, all gathering on what would turn out to be her final day. In the afternoon, a package arrived, medication from the pharmacy. Colin Shanley, still working as cook, accepted the delivery in the kitchen. Before he could bring it to the nursing staff, Lafferty grabbed it from his hands. At 4 p.m., Dr. Kievowitz ordered a morphine drip. Starting dose, 5 milligrams per hour. The order specified that nurses could increase the flow by 1 milligram per hour as needed for pain management. This is standard protocol for terminal patients. You start with a baseline dose and adjust based on the patient's symptoms. Except, that's not what happened. At 6:30 p.m., 2.5 hours after the drip started, the dosage jumped to 10 milligrams per hour, not a 1 milligram increase, double the starting dose. At 7:30 p.m., another increase, 15 milligrams per hour. Before leaving for the night, Dr. Kievowitz personally administered an additional 10 milligram injection. By 4 a.m. on October 28th, the morphine drip had reached 25 milligrams per hour, 5 times the starting dose. Nurses' notes describe Doris's breathing slowing dramatically. fluid was accumulating in her lungs. Her respiratory system was failing. At 5:15 a.m., the nurses administered another injection, this time 100 milligrams of Demerol. The nurse's notes indicate that Dr. Glassman ordered the Demerol by telephone at Dr. Kievowitz's request. Glassman, the plastic surgeon, ordering pain medication in the middle of the night for a patient dying under another doctor's care. Kievowitz, who wasn't present, requesting additional narcotics be given to a patient already receiving extremely high doses of morphine. At 5:48 a.m. on October 28, 1993, Doris Duke stopped breathing. Lafferty was at her bedside. So was William Doyle, the two men who stood to profit most from her death. One as executor, one as representative of the law firm that had already billed the estate over $13 million, were the witnesses to her final moment. Within hours, Dr. Joshua Trabulus, Dr. Kievowitz's partner, who had not been treating Doris and had not witnessed her death, signed the death certificate, cause of death, fluid in the lungs, and acute infection. Before the day ended, Lafferty and Doyle made another decision: immediate cremation. Doris Duke's body was taken to Westwood Mortuary and cremated within hours of her death. No autopsy. No examination by an independent medical examiner. No opportunity for anyone to question the circumstances or test for drug levels. The evidence, if there had been evidence, was now ash. Chapter 9, The Investigation. The questions began almost immediately. Nurses who'd worked in that converted bedroom talked to colleagues. Former doctors who'd treated Doris for years heard about the circumstances and raised concerns. Staff members who'd witnessed Lafferty's transformation from butler to gatekeeper came forward. By early 1994, the Los Angeles District Attorney had launched a formal investigation into possible elder abuse and suspicious death. On March 9th, the document that made Lafferty sole executor. Hospital records showed she suffered from mild drug-induced delirium. 3 separate doctors submitted affidavits concluding that Duke's documented drug combination would have significantly interfered with her thinking. The financial motives were impossible to ignore. Lafferty stood to receive a substantial executor's fee. The law firm had already billed the estate $13.5 million. Dr. Glassman had received $500,000. But suspicion isn't proof. The legal battle shifted to surrogate's court in Manhattan. Chandi Hefner filed 3 separate lawsuits claiming she was the rightful heir. Former advisors claimed the will was invalid due to Duke's impaired mental state. The proceedings dragged on for nearly 2 years. In April 1995, Hefner reached a settlement: $65 million. Part of the agreement included a strict silence clause. Hefner agreed never to discuss publicly her relationship with Doris Duke or the reasons for her expulsion. Whatever she knew about those final years was sealed. The ultimate ruling came later in 1995. Bernard Lafferty was removed as executor. But removal as executor wasn't criminal prosecution. Despite the investigation, despite the suspicious circumstances, despite medical experts questioning the drug administration, no criminal charges were ever filed against Lafferty, Kivowitz, Glassman, or anyone else involved in Doris Duke's final days. The reason was simple and devastating: insufficient evidence. The cremation had destroyed any physical evidence. No autopsy had been performed, no tissue samples preserved. Everything that could have definitively proved or disproved the allegations, drug levels in tissues, evidence of organ damage, had been destroyed in the cremation fire. Without physical evidence, prosecutors had only circumstantial cases built on suspicious timing, questionable dosages, and financial motives. The Los Angeles District Attorney quietly closed the investigation in 1996. No charges filed, no trial, no determination of guilt or innocence. Lafferty received a reduced settlement, nothing close to the original executor's fee, but still substantial. He died in 1996, just 3 years after Doris. The official cause was acute peritonitis. Dr. Kievowitz continued practicing medicine. Dr. Glassman continued performing cosmetic surgeries. William Doyle continued representing wealthy estates. None of them ever admitted wrongdoing. None ever faced criminal consequences. The truth had been cremated along with the evidence. Chapter 10. Paradise Lost. In 1965, at the age of 52, Doris Duke had written a codicil to her will with a single clear instruction: Shangri-La would be maintained after her death for the study and understanding of Islamic art and culture. It took decades, a bitter legal battle, and the resolution of a possible murder investigation before that instruction could be fulfilled. But in the end, the palace she built survived everything that followed. The Doris Duke Foundation for Islamic Art was formally established in 1998. The years that followed were dedicated to preparing Shangri-La for public access, a task that required extraordinary care. By 1999, archivists began cataloging the collection. Over 3,500 individual objects, spanning centuries and civilizations, assembled by one woman over the course of 55 years. The work was painstaking. Each piece needed to be documented, photographed, its provenance traced, its condition assessed. Moroccan cedar ceilings were cleaned and stabilized. Isfahan tile mosaics were examined for hairline fractures. The 13-foot mihrab, 700 years old, one of only 6 surviving examples from the peak of Persian luster production, received particular attention. Major physical repairs and conservation work continued through 2001. The Hawaiian climate, with its salt air and humidity, had taken its toll on materials never designed for this environment. In November 2002, Shangri-La opened to the public for the first time. Tours operate through the Honolulu Museum of Art, which manages the estate on behalf of the foundation. Visitors arrive by shuttle from downtown Honolulu, passing through security gates that once kept the outside world at bay. They walk paths that Doris Duke walked for decades, through gardens that frame the white walls she chose specifically to serve as a neutral canvas. And then they step inside. The foyer opens, with a carved Moroccan cedar ceiling overhead, the work of Ma'alams, master craftsman in René Martin's Rabat workshop, who carved these patterns in 1937 and 1938. Colored light filters through glass set in plaster screens. The massive mashrabia, the great wooden screen, offers geometric glimpses of the courtyard beyond. Their names were never recorded, but their work has survived nearly a century, and visitors pause beneath it now without knowing anything about the hands that shaped it. The rooms have been preserved exactly as Duke left them. Not reconstructions, not period approximations. The actual spaces she lived in, with the actual objects she acquired, arranged largely as she arranged them. The living room draws the eye immediately to the mihrab, the 13th century Persian prayer niche standing nearly 13 feet tall in its arched doorway. Signed by master artist Ali ibn Muhammad ibn Abu Tahir and dated 1265, it is one of the oldest and most significant objects in the entire collection. The luster-painted surface, ceramic glazed with metallic oxides to produce an iridescent sheen, still catches light the way it has for 7 centuries. Beside it, Spanish tiles line the fireplace surround. Medieval shields and lances hang on the walls. Ceramics fill open niches, their glazes deep and luminous. The tented dining room transforms the space entirely. Egyptian and Indian textile appliques hang from the walls, their colors blazing against white plaster. The enormous baccarat crystal chandelier from the 1840s, made specifically for export to the Middle East, scatters prismatic light across surfaces. On the east wall, one of the massive Isfahan tile mosaics commissioned in 1938 occupies its permanent position. The blues and turquoises remain luminous after nearly a century. The Syrian room stops visitors in their tracks. Carved and painted Ajami woodwork covers every surface, ceiling, walls, niches, decorated with metal leaf that catches the light. The marble fountain sits where it would have, in an aristocratic Damascus reception room from the 19th century. The raised seating area invites you to recline on cushions as Syrian aristocrats once did. Step through the doorway, and Hawaii disappears entirely. This was the room Doris rarely used herself. Designed for display, not living. It was the room that revealed, more than any other, how she'd begun to think of Shangri-La, not as a home, but as an institution she was preparing for the future. Outside, the playhouse awaits. Its red columns, the color Mary Crane determined from studying miniature paintings, a choice vindicated by photographs from Isfahan, rise against the Isfahan tile work that covers the exterior. Inside, The tile fireplace features warriors, feasters, and dancers frozen in ceramic. The 75-foot swimming pool stretches the length of the structure, still filled, the water reflecting the columns and tiles above it. This is where Doris swam laps every morning during the decades when Shangri-La was her paradise, before isolation and illness made such mornings impossible. The rooftop pavilion, built from the broken marble jali screens that arrived shattered from India, disaster turned into opportunity by Drew Baker's ingenuity, offers a view of Diamond Head and the Pacific. The screens, reinforced and reassembled, filter the Hawaiian light into geometric shadows, exactly as their makers intended, centuries ago, in a different country, for a different purpose. Throughout the estate, the collection tells a story that spans continents and centuries. Iznik ceramics from 16th century Turkey, Spanish luster tiles from aristocratic collections, textiles from India and Central Asia, carved wood from Damascus and Morocco. Each object was chosen by Doris Duke personally, often after years of searching, often after traveling thousands of miles to see it in context before bringing it home. The result is what scholars call inventive synthesis, not a museum attempting to replicate any single Islamic civilization, but a deeply personal vision assembled from many civilizations at once. Isfahan beside Damascus, Morocco beside Mughal India, Ottoman Turkey beside Safavid Persia. The collection doesn't pretend to be comprehensive or historically rigorous in the way a museum's permanent collection might be. It is something rarer, the testament of one person's lifelong devotion to beauty, translated into stone and tile and wood and ceramic, and preserved for others to experience. The educational mission Duke envisioned in 1965 is now fully realized. The foundation sponsors scholarship and research. Artists participate in residency programs at Shangri-La. Exhibitions explore the techniques and traditions represented in the collection. Scholars study the mihrab, the Syrian room, the Isfahan tile work, contributing to a deeper understanding of Islamic artistic traditions across centuries. Visitors walk through these rooms without knowing, perhaps, the full weight of what they're seeing. They admire the tile work without knowing about the Isfahan workshops where young apprentices cut each piece by hand. They photograph the mihrab without knowing about the years of negotiation it took to acquire, or the Metropolitan Museum's competing offer that Doris outmaneuvered. They marvel at the Syrian room without knowing that an entire bathroom was demolished to make it fit. And they walk through a palace where a woman spent 55 years pursuing beauty. A woman who inherited a fortune at 12, who traveled the world at 22, who built a paradise at 23, and who spent the rest of her life filling it with the finest Islamic art she could find. The rooms hold no trace of what happened in those final months. The morphine drip was in Beverly Hills. The legal battles were fought in Manhattan. The investigation was conducted in Los Angeles. Shangri-La itself was spared the details of Doris Duke's death. It sat empty across the Pacific while the events unfolded 4,000 miles away. What remains here is what she built: the carved ceilings and geometric screens, the centuries-old prayer niche and the Isfahan tiles, the playhouse with its Persian columns and its swimming pool, the Syrian room with its painted wood and marble fountain, the tented dining room with its chandelier and its textiles, 3,500 objects, 55 years of collecting, one woman's vision preserved exactly as she left it, open now for the world to see. The art endures, and in these white-walled rooms where Hawaiian sunlight filters through screens carved by hands that turned to dust centuries ago, Doris Duke's paradise lives on, not as a prison, not as a crime scene, but as the museum she always intended it to become.